Peter Zapffe developed what may be the most radical diagnosis of human consciousness ever proposed. He argued that humanity suffers from a catastrophic biological error. Our capacity for reflection exceeds what evolution required, creating an organism psychologically equipped to destroy itself through awareness alone. Zapffe identified 4 psychological defense mechanisms that prevent humanity from recognizing this truth and collapsing into mass suicide. Isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation function as barriers between consciousness and its own horrifying implications. His work anticipates contemporary debates in consciousness studies, evolutionary psychology, and antinatalist ethics. This exploration examines Zapffel's complete philosophical architecture and its profound implications for how we understand the human condition. Part 1. The Biological Paradox. Zapffel's central argument begins with an evolutionary contradiction. Natural selection optimizes organisms for reproductive success within specific environmental niches. Consciousness emerged as an adaptive trait, allowing organisms to model their environment, predict outcomes, and adjust behavior accordingly. But human consciousness developed representational capacities that vastly exceed any adaptive requirement. We can simulate hypothetical scenarios with no connection to survival, contemplate abstract concepts that provide no fitness advantage, and recognize our own cosmic insignificance. This cognitive surplus creates what Zapffe termed the tragic overproduction of consciousness. The argument differs fundamentally from standard evolutionary mismatch theories. Mismatch theorists argue we evolved for ancestral environments and struggle in modern contexts. Zapffe claims something more radical. Consciousness itself, regardless of environment, generates existential suffering through its basic operations. The problem is not that our Stone Age brains face modern challenges. The problem is that any brain capable of recursive self-reflection will eventually recognize truths incompatible with psychological stability. Consider the specific cognitive capacities that create this crisis. Humans possess episodic future thinking, allowing detailed simulation of our own death. We have theory of mind capacities that recognize other minds as equally valid centers of experience, generating guilt and moral paralysis. We possess causal reasoning that traces our existence back to decisions made by others, revealing our lives as imposed rather than chosen. Each cognitive ability that enhanced our ancestors' survival now produces psychological torment when turned toward existential questions. Thomas Metzinger's phenomenal self-model theory provides contemporary neurophilosophical support for Zapffel's position. Metzinger argues consciousness constructs a transparent self-model, meaning we experience the model without recognizing it as a model. This creates what he calls the ego tunnel, a representational structure that generates the illusion of being a substantial, enduring self. The self-model requires continuous updating and integration of information, burning cognitive resources to maintain an ultimately fictional entity. But Metzinger's framework introduces a critical ambiguity in Zapffel's argument. If the suffering self is phenomenologically constructed, does recognizing its constructedness dissolve the suffering? Metzinger suggests enlightenment experiences occur when the self-model temporarily deactivates, creating states of pure awareness without subject-object duality. This implies a potential escape route from Zapffel's biological trap. Zapffe would likely counter that even recognizing the constructed nature of selfhood requires the very consciousness that generates suffering. The meta-awareness of illusion is itself another layer of excessive consciousness. Evolutionary spandrel theory presents a different challenge to Zapffel's teleological framing. Gould and Lewontin demonstrated that many biological features exist not as direct adaptations but as architectural byproducts. If advanced consciousness emerged as a spandrel, a side effect of selection for other traits like language or social coordination, does this undermine Zapfe's argument about overshooting? The concept of overshooting implies a target that was missed or exceeded. Spandrels have no target at all. This critique misunderstands Zapfe's core claim. Whether consciousness was directly selected or emerged as a byproduct, the functional relationship remains identical. An organism possesses cognitive capacities that exceed what natural selection would maintain if it directly optimized for them. Spandrel theory actually strengthens Zapfe's position by removing teleological assumptions. Consciousness is not an overshot arrow but an accidental architectural consequence, making the suffering it produces even more absurd and purposeless. The distinction between Zapfe's overshot consciousness and Nagel's view from nowhere problem requires careful analysis. Nagel identified an epistemic paradox. We aspire to objective knowledge, but can only access reality through irreducibly subjective perspectives. This creates genuine philosophical puzzles about reduction, explanation, and the nature of objectivity. Zapfe's concern operates at a different level entirely. His argument is phenomenological and psychological rather than epistemic. For Zapffe, the problem is not that subjective experience resists objective explanation. The problem is that subjective experience itself, when sufficiently developed, becomes unbearable. Consciousness does not fail to grasp objective reality adequately. Rather, consciousness grasps certain features of reality too well, recognizing its own contingency, mortality, and ultimate meaninglessness. Where Nagel worries about the explanatory gap between physical and phenomenal, Zapffe identifies a survivability gap between cognitive capacity and psychological tolerance. Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis offers another contemporary framework that both illuminates and complicates Zapfe's thesis. Damasio argues consciousness evolved to integrate bodily states with cognitive processing, allowing organisms to feel the implications of their thoughts. This emotional tagging of representations enhances decision-making by marking options with effective valence. But this same mechanism becomes catastrophic when applied to existential recognition. Understanding our own mortality gets tagged with somatic dread. Recognizing cosmic indifference triggers physiological panic responses. The very neural architecture that makes consciousness adaptive for immediate survival becomes maladaptive when processing ultimate concerns. Zapfe's biological paradox thus crystallizes into a precise claim. Human consciousness possesses representational range that exceeds any fitness function, generating knowledge about existence that our emotional and motivational systems cannot process without breakdown. We are organisms designed by natural selection to survive and reproduce, burdened with minds capable of recognizing that survival and reproduction have no ultimate justification or purpose. This is not merely cognitive dissonance, but architectural contradiction. The biological imperative to continue living conflicts with the cognitive recognition that life has no basis for continuation beyond arbitrary biological programming. Consciousness reveals its own groundlessness, creating what Zapffe termed the cosmic panic underlying all human experience. Part 2. Isolation as Defense. Zapffe identified isolation as the first psychological defense mechanism against existential awareness. For decades, he refused to read newspapers or engage with current events beyond his immediate mountain community. This was not mere personal eccentricity, but a deliberately constructed epistemological quarantine. Isolation functions by arbitrarily limiting the scope of conscious attention, preventing awareness from expanding into territories that trigger existential panic. We select which aspects of reality to acknowledge and which to ignore, creating artificial boundaries around consciousness itself. The mechanism operates through selective ignorance that masquerades as practical wisdom. People claim they avoid news because it is depressing or unproductive, framing isolation as healthy boundary setting. But Zapffe recognized this as unconscious self-protection. Each fact about distant suffering, each reminder of mortality, each recognition of cosmic scale threatens to puncture our psychological defenses. Isolation constructs what we might call perceptual firewalls, filtering information before it reaches the level of conscious processing. Miranda Fricke's work on epistemic injustice provides an unexpected lens for analyzing Zapfe's isolation mechanism. Fricke describes testimonial injustice where credibility is denied to certain speakers based on prejudice. But Zapfe's isolation involves self-imposed epistemic injustice. We preemptively deny credibility to information sources that might destabilize our defenses. The difference is that this injustice serves psychological survival rather than social dominance. We become epistemically unjust toward reality itself, refusing to grant it testimonial authority over our beliefs. This raises a profound question about epistemic responsibility. Fricke argues we have ethical obligations to grant proper credibility to speakers and to cultivate our capacity for accurate credibility assessment. But if full epistemic openness leads to psychological collapse, does ethical epistemic conduct require us to embrace madness? Zapfe's answer is that humans cannot afford epistemic virtue. The truth is too terrible for sustained attention. Isolation is not a moral failing, but a biological necessity. Heidegger's concept of thrownness presents a fundamental challenge to isolation as a coherent defense. Heidegger argued that human existence is always already thrown into a world not of our choosing. We find ourselves embedded in historical, cultural and linguistic contexts that shape our understanding before we can reflect on them. This thrownness is not something we can escape through isolation because it constitutes the very structure of our being. We are always already exposed to the world in ways that precede any defensive maneuver. From a Heideggerian perspective, Zapfe's isolation appears phenomenologically impossible. Even refusing to read newspapers, we remain thrown into language, mortality, and historical situatedness. The very act of isolating oneself requires background understanding of what one is isolating from. This means existential awareness cannot be quarantined, because it structures the conditions of possibility for any experience whatsoever. Zapffe might respond that isolation is not about achieving perfect epistemic enclosure, but about reducing the frequency and intensity of existential confrontations. Even partial barriers provide temporary relief. Buddhist mindfulness practices present a fascinating counterpoint to Zapffian isolation. Where Zapffe advocates restricting awareness, Buddhism prescribes expanding it. Mindfulness encourages non-judgmental attention to all arising phenomena, including existential anxiety and the recognition of impermanence. The Buddhist approach suggests that suffering comes not from awareness itself, but from our reactive relationship to what we perceive. Through sustained practice, one might observe mortality and meaninglessness without psychological collapse. Yet this apparent opposition may conceal a deeper similarity. Both Zapfe's isolation and Buddhist mindfulness recognize that ordinary consciousness generates suffering. Both propose radical alterations to default modes of awareness. The difference lies in their respective strategies. Zapffe advocates restricting content, limiting what enters conscious awareness. Buddhism advocates transforming process, changing how awareness relates to its contents. But both implicitly accept that standard human consciousness in its unmodified form cannot tolerate full existential recognition. The isolation mechanism reveals itself most clearly in contemporary information avoidance behaviors. People curate social media feeds to exclude disturbing content, skip news articles about climate change, and avoid conversations about mortality. These micro-isolations accumulate into comprehensive reality filters. We construct personalized epistemic bubbles designed not for ideological comfort, but for existential protection. Each act of avoidance slightly narrows the aperture through which reality enters consciousness. Zapffe recognized that isolation operates most effectively when unconscious. Once we become aware that we are isolating ourselves from truth, the defense partially fails. Meta-awareness of our defensive maneuvers triggers the very anxiety they were designed to prevent. This creates a paradox. The most effective isolation happens when we genuinely believe our restricted awareness reflects complete reality. Philosophical reflection on isolation necessarily weakens isolation itself. Zapfe's own writings about the mechanism demonstrate this self-undermining quality. By explaining how isolation works, he made it harder for his readers to employ it successfully. Part 3. Anchoring mechanisms. Anchoring constitutes the second defense mechanism, operating through attachment to arbitrary fixation points that generate illusory meaning. Zapffe observed that Norwegians continued attending state church services despite widespread atheism among the population. This behavior revealed anchoring in its pure form. People clung to collective rituals not from belief, but from desperate need for stable reference points. The content of anchoring matters less than its function as a psychological mooring preventing drift into existential vertigo. Anchoring operates across multiple scales simultaneously. Individuals anchor to careers, relationships, political ideologies, and personal projects. Collectives anchor to national identities, historical narratives, and shared cultural practices. Each anchor provides temporary resistance against the recognition that all human concerns are equally groundless. The anchors do not justify themselves through argument or evidence. They function through habituation and emotional investment, creating felt significance that bypasses rational evaluation. Ernest Becker's work in The Denial of Death provides remarkable convergence with Zapfe's anchoring concept through what Becker termed immortality projects. Becker argued that humans construct symbolic systems promising transcendence of mortality. We invest in projects, institutions, and legacies that will outlast our individual deaths. These immortality projects range from having children to building civilizations. Terror management theory, developed from Becker's work, has provided experimental evidence that mortality salience increases investment in cultural worldviews and self-esteem projects. But Zapfe's anchoring differs from Becker's immortality projects in a crucial respect. Becker believed these projects, while ultimately futile, genuinely provide meaning and purpose during life. He saw them as noble lies that enable human flourishing despite tragic awareness. Zapffe viewed anchoring as pure defense mechanism, generating only the illusion of meaning. Anchors do not actually create significance. They merely prevent us from recognizing the absence of significance. This distinction reflects deeper disagreement about whether meaning can be constructed or only discovered. Sarah Perry's extension of Zapffe in Every Cradle is a grave introduces anchoring as the primary barrier to suicide. Perry argues that people remain alive not from positive reasons, but from anchoring mechanisms that prevent rational evaluation of existence. We cling to anchors like relationships, responsibilities and future plans that make ending life seem to violate something important. The anchors do not make life worth living in any objective sense. They simply create enough psychological resistance that suicide remains undone. Perry's analysis suggests anchoring is less about generating meaning and more about generating inertia. This raises disturbing questions about the ethics of anchor maintenance. If anchors function primarily to prevent suicide rather than enhance flourishing, should we strengthen or weaken them? Public health approaches typically aim to strengthen anchors through community connection, purpose cultivation and meaning-making interventions. But from Zapfe's perspective, this merely reinforces the defense mechanisms preventing honest reckoning with existence. We become doctors managing symptoms of a disease we refuse to diagnose. Sartre's analysis of bad faith illuminates the phenomenology of anchoring with uncomfortable precision. Bad faith involves self-deception about our own freedom and facticity, the interplay between what we choose and what constrains us. Sartre distinguished pre-reflective consciousness, our immediate non-thematic awareness, from reflective consciousness, our explicit self-awareness. Anchoring operates primarily at the pre-reflective level. We live through our anchors without examining them, experiencing them as natural givens rather than desperate constructions. Reflective consciousness threatens to expose anchors as bad faith, revealing our complicity in maintaining comforting fictions. The question becomes whether anchoring necessarily involves bad faith or whether it can be adopted with full awareness. Can someone consciously choose to invest in family, nation or ideology while simultaneously recognizing these as arbitrary fixation points? Sartre would likely argue this is impossible. Authentic engagement requires genuine commitment, not the self-aware performance of commitment. Zapffe seems to agree. Once we recognize anchors as defense mechanisms, they lose their anchoring power. The mechanism only works when experienced as reality rather than as coping strategy. Modern consumer capitalism has industrialized anchor production. Markets generate endless pseudo-meaningful activities, identities and affiliations for purchase. Each product promises to serve as stable reference point, from fitness regimens to political movements to lifestyle brands. These commercial anchors share something with traditional religious or communal anchors. They create temporary sense of purpose and belonging, but their manufactured quality and rapid obsolescence make them particularly fragile. We cycle through anchors at increasing speed, each providing diminishing returns of existential stability. Zapffe recognized that anchoring contains an internal contradiction. The mechanism requires investment of attention and energy in arbitrary pursuits. But this investment itself can trigger awareness of arbitrariness. Why am I devoting my life to this particular anchor rather than any other? The question undermines the anchor even as we cling to it. This creates a strange, double consciousness. We must simultaneously commit to our anchors absolutely and avoid examining that commitment too closely. The anchored life requires perpetual vigilance against its own recognition as anchored. Part 4. Distraction economics. Distraction operates as the third defense mechanism through continuous activity that prevents existential confrontation. Writing in 1933, Zapffe predicted the emergence of systems designed specifically to capture and monopolize human attention. He foresaw that industrial societies would generate endless entertainment, busyness and stimulation to keep consciousness occupied. The distracted mind never settles long enough to recognize its own condition. Modern attention economies have vindicated Zapfe's analysis with disturbing precision. Distraction differs from isolation and anchoring in its operational logic. Isolation limits what enters awareness. Anchoring creates stable fixation points within awareness. Distraction continuously redirects awareness, preventing sustained focus on any single object, especially existential concerns. The mechanism operates through velocity rather than exclusion or fixation. Consciousness remains perpetually in motion, scanning rapidly across surfaces without penetrating depths. Byung-Chul Han's The Burnout Society provides contemporary vindication of Zapfe's distraction thesis through analysis of achievement subject psychology. Han argues that late capitalism no longer disciplines subjects through external prohibition. Instead, it produces subjects who drive themselves through internalized imperatives of productivity and optimization. The achievement subject exhausts itself through voluntary hyperactivity, interpreting rest as personal failure. Han describes this as a totalitarian system that appears permissive. We are free to do anything except stop. Han's analysis reveals distraction as structural condition rather than individual failing. The society itself requires distraction to maintain economic and social functionality. Workers must remain perpetually engaged with tasks, consumers with products, citizens with spectacles. Any population that collectively stopped moving, stopped consuming, stopped optimizing would threaten systemic reproduction. Distraction serves capital accumulation while simultaneously preventing existential reckoning that might question the entire apparatus. The Frankfurt School's culture-industry critique intersects with, but ultimately misses, Zapfe's deeper point about distraction. Adorno and Horkheimer argued mass entertainment pacifies populations, preventing critical consciousness that might challenge domination. Culture industry produces standardized content that precludes genuine aesthetic experience or revolutionary potential. This critique focuses on ideological manipulation and social control. Zapffe recognized distraction operates at a more fundamental level. Even without capitalist structures, consciousness seeks distraction from itself. The difference appears in how each framework interprets resistance. Frankfurt School theorists believed authentic culture could awaken critical consciousness and enable emancipation. Zapffe saw distraction as biological necessity rather than ideological construct. Remove culture industry, and people will create their own distractions through whatever means available. The problem is not that distraction is imposed, but that consciousness cannot tolerate its own unmediated presence to itself. We would need distraction in any social formation whatsoever. Pascal's concept of divertissement provides historical precedent for understanding distraction. But Zapfe's analysis goes significantly further. Pascal observed that humans cannot bear sitting quietly in a room alone with their thoughts. We seek diversion from the misery of confronting our true condition. But Pascal viewed this as spiritual failing, something to overcome through religious devotion. Zapffe recognized distraction as permanent requirement, not deficiency to be corrected. There is no spiritual practice or philosophical insight that eliminates the need for distraction. The distinction between Pascalian divertissement and Zapffian distraction hinges on intensity and purpose. Pascal described turning away from existential concerns toward trivial pursuits. Zapffe identified a more desperate pattern. Distraction is not mere turning away, but frantic occupation, filling every moment to prevent any possibility of existential reflection. Pascal's gambler seeks pleasure. Zapfe's distracted subject seeks obliteration of reflective space itself. The difference is between avoidance and annihilation of self-awareness. Digital technology has intensified distraction beyond what Zapffe could have imagined while confirming his basic analysis. Smartphones provide instant access to infinite content, ensuring no moment need ever remain unoccupied. Social media platforms engineer their interfaces specifically to maximize engagement, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities to capture attention. These systems have optimized distraction through algorithmic precision. We no longer need to seek distraction actively. It arrives unbidden, carefully calibrated to our individual susceptibilities. Yet Zapffe would argue that blaming technology for distraction reverses cause and effect. We created these systems because consciousness demands distraction. The attention economy emerged to meet a biological need, not to create one. Technology simply industrialized and scaled a defense mechanism that humans have always required. Medieval peasants had far fewer distractions available, but still structured their lives around whatever diversions they could access. Festivals, gossip, religious ritual, and work itself served distraction functions. Digital technology merely perfected distraction's delivery without altering its essential purpose. Part 5. Sublimation Through Art. Sublimation operates as the fourth defense mechanism, transforming existential horror into aesthetic objects. Zapffe himself practiced sublimation through his mountaineering essays, creating literature from experiences of confronting death and meaninglessness. This generated a performative contradiction in his work. He wrote philosophically about the impossibility of philosophical consolation. He created beauty from recognition that beauty cannot redeem existence. Sublimation acknowledges the horror while claiming to transcend it through artistic transformation. The mechanism converts raw existential awareness into crafted representations. The artist confronts meaninglessness directly, but channels that confrontation through formal aesthetic structures. Poetry about death, paintings of despair, music expressing cosmic indifference. Each artistic sublimation claims to have achieved distance from its source material. The suffering becomes objectified, placed at aesthetic remove where it can be contemplated without destroying the contemplator. But Zapffe questioned whether this transformation is genuine or merely another defense. Nietzsche's concept of tragic affirmation seems to offer an alternative to Zapfe's pessimistic sublimation. Nietzsche argued Greek tragedy revealed terrible truths about existence, but transfigured horror through aesthetic form. The tragic spectator confronts suffering and meaninglessness, yet emerges with life-affirming energy. Tragedy does not deny the horror, but justifies existence as aesthetic phenomenon. For Nietzsche, this represents the highest form of human response to existential awareness. Life redeems itself through beauty, even when truth reveals life as groundless. Zapfe's sublimation differs crucially from Nietzschean tragic affirmation. Nietzsche believed aesthetic experience could genuinely transform one's relationship to existence, creating authentic affirmation. Zapffe saw sublimation as sophisticated avoidance, not transcendence. The artist creates beauty from horror, but does not overcome horror. Sublimation provides temporary relief, a momentary sense of having mastered what remains unmastered. The aesthetic object stands as testament to the defense mechanism, not evidence of successful transformation. Where Nietzsche found redemption through art, Zapffe found only more elaborate denial. Adorno's famous statement that writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric presents a challenge to sublimation's ethical legitimacy. Adorno later qualified this claim, but the underlying concern remains potent. If suffering is real and overwhelming, aestheticizing it appears obscene. Creating beauty from horror may constitute a betrayal of those who suffer. Sublimation risks transforming genuine catastrophe into material for artistic consumption. The aesthetic object asks us to appreciate form rather than respond to content. Applied to Zapfe's framework, this critique becomes even more devastating. If all human life constitutes unjustifiable suffering, sublimating that recognition into philosophy or art seems ethically monstrous. Zapfe's own essays about meaninglessness become aesthetic objects that other readers consume for intellectual pleasure. The horror gets packaged for academic discussion and artistic appreciation. This suggests sublimation may be the most dishonest defense mechanism. It pretends to acknowledge truth while actually domesticating truth into consumable form. Freud's original conception of sublimation involved channeling instinctual drives into socially acceptable outlets. Sexual energy becomes artistic creativity. Aggressive impulses become competitive sports. This model treats sublimation as a hydraulic process, redirecting psychological pressure without resolving its source. Zapfe's sublimation operates differently. The goal is not redirecting energy, but creating representations that seemingly master what they represent. Sublimation claims to achieve symbolic control over existential threats. The artist who depicts death claims to have encompassed death within their creative act. But Zapffe recognized this claim as illusory. Sublimation achieves recognition without resolution. The artist acknowledges meaninglessness through their work, but this acknowledgement does not solve the problem of meaninglessness. Instead, it converts the problem into an object, something that can be exhibited, discussed, and appreciated. The existential threat becomes a philosophical topic or aesthetic motif. This transformation changes our relationship to horror from immediate confrontation to mediated contemplation. Yet the horror itself remains entirely unchanged. Contemporary art that explicitly thematizes existential despair demonstrates sublimation's limits. Artists create works about suicide, meaninglessness, and cosmic horror. These works circulate through galleries and museums, receiving critical analysis and market valuation. The institutional apparatus treats existential despair as content to be curated. This reveals sublimation's fundamental problem. Once horror becomes art, it joins a system of cultural production and consumption that neutralizes its threatening qualities. The sublimated object no longer challenges existence, but becomes another aesthetic experience among many. Sublimation saves consciousness by converting truth into commodity. Part 6. The Last Messiah, Zapfe's essay. The Last Messiah presents his most radical claim about human destiny. He argues that Jesus was the first to recognize the horror of existence, but the last to preach salvation from it. The next Messiah, if one comes, must preach voluntary extinction. This Messiah will not offer redemption or afterlife, but simply cessation of the catastrophic mistake called consciousness. The essay positions human extinction as the only coherent response to recognizing consciousness as biological error. Zapfe's Christological framework recasts religious history as failed attempts to justify consciousness. Jesus offered salvation through faith, Buddha through enlightenment, Muhammad through submission to divine will. Each Messiah recognized suffering as fundamental to existence. Each proposed a solution that supposedly transcended suffering while maintaining existence. But Zapffe argues these solutions merely represent more sophisticated anchoring mechanisms. They create elaborate meaning structures without addressing the root problem that consciousness itself generates suffering. The last Messiah must therefore break from all previous salvation narratives. Rather than promising transcendence, transformation, or redemption, this figure must acknowledge that existence has no solution. The appropriate response is not to improve existence, but to end it gracefully. Voluntary human extinction through refusing to reproduce represents the ultimate expression of compassion. We spare future generations the burden of consciousness by ensuring no future generations arise. David Benatar's asymmetry argument provides contemporary philosophical support for Zapffian antinatalism through formal ethical reasoning. Benatar argues that bringing someone into existence always harms them because it creates both actual suffering and deprivation of pleasure's absence. But not bringing someone into existence harms no one because non-existent beings cannot be deprived. This asymmetry means procreation is always ethically impermissible. Benatar's argument operates through careful analysis of harm and benefit rather than appeals to cosmic horror. Yet it reaches conclusions strikingly similar to Zapffe's messianic vision. The distinction between Benatar's asymmetry argument and Zapffe's panic argument reveals different paths to antinatalist conclusions. Benatar focuses on harm avoidance and rational ethical calculation. His argument aims to show that even modest assumptions about ethics entail antinatalism. Zapffe grounds antinatalism in phenomenological recognition of consciousness as catastrophe. Benatar says procreation is wrong because it harms the created being. Zapffe says procreation is wrong because it perpetuates the biological mistake of excessive consciousness. Both conclude humans should not reproduce, but for different reasons operating at different philosophical levels. Rivka Weinberg's The Risk of a Lifetime presents the most sophisticated challenge to antinatalist conclusions. Weinberg argues that procreation involves imposing risks on another person without their consent. This seems problematic, but Weinberg contends that procreation can be permissible if parents minimize risks and maximize goods for their children. She defends a consent-based framework where the impossibility of prior consent does not automatically render procreation impermissible. Parents act as trustees for future interests of beings they create, analogous to emergency medical treatment without explicit consent. Zapffe would likely reject Weinberg's framework as missing the fundamental issue. The problem is not that parents cannot obtain consent or might fail to minimize risks. The problem is that consciousness itself is harm that cannot be justified or compensated. No amount of goods provided to the child can rectify the violation of forcing consciousness into existence. Weinberg assumes life can contain sufficient value to justify its risks. Zapffe denies this possibility entirely. Consciousness is not risky, it is catastrophic. The distinction collapses procreation into unambiguous ethical wrong. Walter Benjamin's concept of messianic time provides theoretical framework for understanding Zapffe's temporal imagination. Benjamin distinguished between empty homogeneous time, the endless linear progression of history, and messianic time, the revolutionary rupture that redeems history. The Messiah does not arrive within historical time, but breaks historical time itself. Zapffe's last Messiah operates similarly, but inverts Benjamin's redemptive vision. Rather than redeeming history by giving it meaning, the last Messiah redeems history by terminating it. The messianic rupture is not fulfillment but cessation. This produces terminated time as alternative to both linear progression and redemptive rupture. Terminated time is history consciously ended, not destroyed through catastrophe but concluded through recognition. Humanity looks at its own trajectory and decides to stop. This decision represents the only authentic response to consciousness recognizing its own nature. The last Messiah does not offer meaning that justifies continuation. Instead, the last Messiah provides the courage and clarity needed to choose extinction over perpetuating the mistake. Zapfe's messianic vision thus inverts every traditional salvation narrative. Where religions promise eternal life, the last Messiah offers eternal non-existence. Where prophets call for faith, this figure demands recognition. Where saviours sacrifice themselves so others might live, the last Messiah asks all to sacrifice themselves by refusing to create others. This represents not nihilistic destruction, but what Zapffe considered the most ethical act possible. Ending consciousness ends suffering. The last Messiah is the only truly compassionate figure in human history. Part 7. Norwegian Pessimism. Zapfe's philosophy emerges from specifically Norwegian cultural and environmental conditions. The extreme darkness of Nordic winters, months of near-total absence of sunlight, creates existential conditions unavailable elsewhere. This darkness is not merely lack of light, but presence of something oppressive. It weighs on consciousness, stripping away distractions and forcing confrontation with existence itself. Norwegian pessimism grew from this ecological substrate, where nature itself seems indifferent or hostile to human meaning-making. Zapffe positioned himself within a tradition of Nordic existential despair, including Ibsen and Munch. Ibsen's plays systematically dismantled every source of meaning and consolation. Characters discover their life projects are built on lies, their relationships are hollow, their moral frameworks are hypocritical. Munch's paintings, especially The Scream, depict existential horror made visible. The figure screams not at any particular threat, but at existence itself. The landscape behind warps and undulates, reality itself seems unstable. Zapffe inherited this tradition, but radicalized it into systematic philosophy. Eugene Thacker's cosmic pessimism represents American appropriation and potential distortion of Zapfe's Norwegian tradition. Thacker develops pessimism into meditation on the inhuman and the unknown, what he calls the world without us. He draws on horror fiction and speculative philosophy to articulate reality fundamentally indifferent to human concerns. Thacker's pessimism emphasizes cosmic scale and humanity's insignificance. But this may miss the specifically biological and psychological focus of Zapfe's analysis. Zapffe was not primarily concerned with cosmic indifference, but with consciousness as malfunction. The difference reflects broader divergence between continental and American pessimistic traditions. Continental pessimism often maintains phenomenological grounding in lived experience of despair. American cosmic pessimism tends toward abstract meditation on vast scales and alien realities. Thacker's pessimism can feel almost aesthetic, even pleasurable in its articulation of cosmic horror. Zapfe's pessimism remains visceral and immediate. It describes psychological states that threaten to overwhelm, not fascinating speculations about reality beyond human access. A biocultural critique challenges whether seasonal affective disorder explains what appears as philosophical insight. Perhaps Nordic pessimism results from vitamin D deficiency and disrupted circadian rhythms rather than profound recognition of truth. The same conclusions reached in perpetual darkness might dissolve under Mediterranean sun. This suggests pessimistic philosophy could be a symptom of environmental stressors rather than valid metaphysical position. We might treat Zapffe with light therapy rather than engage his arguments. But this critique assumes biological explanation invalidates philosophical content. Even if seasonal darkness contributed to Zapfe's pessimism, this does not determine whether his conclusions are correct. Depression might enable recognition of truths that healthier psychology prevents one from seeing. The causation could run opposite to what the biocultural critique assumes. Perhaps seasonal darkness removes certain cognitive biases, allowing clearer perception of existential reality. The fact that most humans avoid pessimistic conclusions might indicate successful defense mechanisms rather than accurate worldviews. Comparing Zapffe with other Nordic philosophical traditions reveals his singularity. Finnish culture celebrates sisu, a concept combining resilience, determination and stoic courage in face of adversity. Swedish legum emphasizes moderation, balance and appropriate measure in all things. Both concepts represent responses to harsh Nordic conditions through meaning-making and value construction. Zapffe rejected these entirely. For him, resilience and balance merely represent more sophisticated defense mechanisms. They do not address the fundamental problem that consciousness cannot be redeemed through cultural values. Norwegian pessimism thus occupies unique position in Nordic thought. It refuses consolation available through cultural meaning-making while remaining grounded in specific environmental reality. The darkness of Norwegian winters becomes not problem to overcome, but truth to recognize. Where other traditions build cultural forms to resist environmental hostility, Zapffe accepted that hostility as revealing existence's true nature. The landscape does not care about human presence. This indifference extends to reality itself. Norwegian pessimism makes philosophical claim from geographical fact, deriving metaphysics from meteorology. Part 8. Mountaineering Metaphysics. Zapffe devoted much of his life to mountaineering, achieving numerous first ascents in Norwegian peaks. This passion created another layer of paradox in his philosophy. He argued that human existence is unjustifiable suffering, yet he repeatedly risked death climbing mountains. The vertical dimension of mountaineering offered temporary escape from horizontal existence, from the everyday terrain of human concerns. Height provided what might be called ontological distance from the biological condition. In Zapfe's experience, mountains stripped away defense mechanisms while replacing them with immediate confrontation with death. Climbing required total focus, eliminating space for distraction or sublimation. The mountain demanded presence without psychological buffering. Yet this presence differed from existential panic because it remained anchored in physical activity and concrete danger. Mountaineering allowed consciousness to encounter its own fragility without collapsing into despair. The vertical escape was not transcendence, but displacement of existential awareness into bodily risk. Reinhold Messner developed a philosophy of mountaineering centered on what he called borderline situations. Messner, who completed first solo ascent of Everest without oxygen, argued climbing creates experiences of extreme limit. At these borders between life and death, self and environment, consciousness encounters something essential about existence. Messner's borderline situations seem to affirm life through intensity, discovering meaning in extreme experience. Zapfe's mountaineering operated differently. He sought not intensity that affirms, but temporary relief from the burden of consciousness itself. A Marxist critique would challenge mountaineering philosophy as privileged escapism. Only those with economic resources and leisure time can pursue vertical transcendence. Workers struggling for survival cannot afford philosophical expeditions to mountain peaks. This suggests mountaineering metaphysics reflects class position disguised as universal insight. The luxury to contemplate existence from summit depends on others maintaining the material base that enables such contemplation. Zapfe's vertical escape might be possible only for those whose horizontal existence is already secured. Yet Zapffe would likely accept this critique as reinforcing rather than undermining his position. The fact that most humans cannot access mountaineering does not invalidate what mountains reveal. It simply means most humans must rely more heavily on other defense mechanisms. The worker who cannot climb mountains employs distraction and anchoring more extensively. Zapffe never claimed mountains provide solution to the problem of consciousness. They offer only temporary respite, available to those privileged enough to reach them. This makes the situation more rather than less tragic. Even the escapes from existence require resources most do not possess. Deleuze and Guattari's plateau concept offers contrasting spatial ontology to Zapfe's vertical escape. Plateaus are regions of continuous intensity without culmination or hierarchy. They spread horizontally, connecting heterogeneous elements without ascending toward peaks or descending to depths. This horizontal ontology celebrates immanence rather than transcendence. For Deleuze and Guattari, meaning emerges from connections and flows across plateaus, not from ascending to heights. Zapfe's verticality represents exactly what they reject, a hierarchical organization of space and value. The difference reveals opposed responses to existence. Deleuze and Guattari affirm horizontal life, finding creation and meaning in lateral connections. Zapffe saw horizontal existence as precisely the problem, the plane of biological drives and social obligations that consciousness cannot tolerate. Vertical escape attempts to rise above this plane temporarily. Neither approach solves the problem of consciousness. Plateaus still require consciousness to navigate them. Mountains still return climbers to horizontal world, but the spatial metaphors indicate fundamentally different orientations toward existence itself. Zapfe's mountaineering essays reveal sublimation operating at meta-level. He transformed his vertical escapes into literary objects, writing about climbing in ways that made the experience available to readers. This creates performative contradiction within performative contradiction. He used sublimation to write about mountaineering that itself functioned as escape from need for sublimation. The essays become defense mechanisms describing defense mechanisms describing defense mechanisms. Each layer acknowledges the previous while adding new level of aesthetic distance. Zapfe's mountaineering philosophy thus demonstrates the inescapability of the very mechanisms it analyzes. Part 9. Against Schopenhauer. Zapfe's relationship to Schopenhauer appears paradoxical at first. Both philosophers shared fundamental pessimism about existence and recognized suffering as intrinsic to consciousness. Yet Zapffe explicitly rejected Schopenhauer's ethical system despite agreeing with his metaphysical diagnosis. This rejection hinges on Schopenhauer's doctrine of compassion as primary moral response. Zapffe argued that compassion represents another anchoring mechanism, not genuine ethical insight. Schopenhauer grounded ethics in recognition of will's unity underlying apparent individuation. When I see another suffering, I recognize the same will to live that drives my own existence. This recognition generates compassion, feeling others' suffering as if it were my own. For Schopenhauer, compassion provides the only legitimate basis for ethics. It emerges from metaphysical insight into reality's fundamental nature. The compassionate person sees through the veil of Maya, the illusion of separation, recognizing all suffering as manifestation of single cosmic will. Zapffe found this ethical move deeply problematic. If existence is suffering without justification, compassion merely extends recognition of this fact. But such recognition provides no grounds for action or obligation. Schopenhauer says I should reduce suffering because I recognize unity with others. Zapffe asks why recognizing shared catastrophe generates duty rather than shared despair. Compassion becomes another way to anchor consciousness, creating sense of moral purpose from meaningless suffering. We tell ourselves that alleviating suffering matters, but this merely disguises the fact that suffering itself reveals existence as mistake. Sandra Shapshay has attempted rehabilitative reading of Schopenhauer's ethics, arguing his compassion doctrine offers genuine moral insight. Shapshay contends that recognizing the unity of will does provide basis for obligation. If separation between individuals is illusory, harming another literally harms oneself. This makes ethics rationally mandatory rather than sentimentally optional. Shapshay's reading tries to save Schopenhauer from the charge that his pessimism undermines his ethics. But Zapfe's critique strikes deeper than Shapshay's rehabilitation can address. Even if harming others harms oneself, this assumes self-harm should be avoided. Zapffe questions why the will to live deserves perpetuation or protection at all. If will is blind striving that generates only suffering, perhaps we should embrace its destruction rather than minimize harm within it. Compassion that reduces suffering helps the will continue its pointless operations. True compassion might mean working towards will's extinction, not its amelioration. Schopenhauer's ethics preserves what his metaphysics condemns. This raises the question whether Zapfe's view entails complete ethical nihilism or suggests alternative ethics. If consciousness is catastrophic error and existence unjustifiable, do moral distinctions collapse entirely? Some interpret Zapffe as eliminating grounds for any ethical claims whatsoever. Without meaning or value in existence, ethics becomes arbitrary human construction. But another reading suggests Zapffe implies negative ethics, moral framework built on harm avoidance taken to logical extreme. The supreme ethical principle becomes, do not create consciousness. All other ethical concerns become secondary to preventing new suffering through preventing new existence. The distinction between will to life as fundamental problem versus consciousness curse provides key difference between Schopenhauer and Zapffe. Schopenhauer located suffering in will itself, the blind striving that constitutes reality. Consciousness merely makes will aware of itself, creating individual experience of universal striving. For Zapffe, consciousness is the specific problem. Will to life in unconscious organisms proceeds without suffering. Only when consciousness emerges does existence become unbearable. Plants and simple animals embody will without experiencing the torture of awareness. This distinction generates different attitudes toward existence. Schopenhauer's pessimism extends to all manifestations of will. The entire world is suffering because will is suffering. Zapfe's pessimism targets consciousness specifically. Non-conscious existence may be neutral rather than negative. This makes human extinction a solution rather than tragedy. Eliminating consciousness eliminates the problem without necessarily condemning all existence. Zapfe's antinatalism thus becomes more precise than Schopenhauer's general pessimism. Zapfe's rejection of Schopenhauerian compassion ultimately reflects different philosophical temperaments despite shared pessimistic conclusions. Schopenhauer wanted to preserve ethical framework within his pessimism, maintaining obligation even without ultimate justification. Zapffe accepted that recognizing consciousness as error eliminates traditional moral categories. We are left with single imperative: end the mistake. Any ethics that tries to find meaning or purpose within existence simply adds another layer of defense mechanisms. Compassion for Zapffe is final attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Part 10. The Panic Phenomenology. Zapffe identified what he termed cosmic panic as the primordial baseline of human consciousness before defense mechanisms activate. This is not ordinary anxiety about specific threats, but foundational horror at existence itself. The child's first genuine why question marks the beginning of this recognition. Not why is the sky blue, which seeks information, but why is there anything at all which confronts groundlessness? This moment initiates trajectory toward full awareness that consciousness cannot sustain without defensive operations. Cosmic panic differs phenomenologically from what psychology typically categorizes as anxiety or fear. Fear directs itself toward specific objects or situations that threaten harm. Anxiety in psychiatric frameworks often appears as fear without clear object, free-floating apprehension. But cosmic panic precedes this structure entirely. It is not fear of something or anxiety about something. It represents consciousness encountering its own existence as problem, recognizing itself as that which should not be. The panic arises from awareness becoming aware of awareness, creating recursive loop that reveals the impossibility of self-justification. Emmanuel Levinas described a phenomenon he called the il-ia, which translates roughly as there is or there is being. For Levinas, the il-ia names impersonal existence prior to any entities or subjects. It is not nothing, but neither is it something determinate. The il-ia appears in experiences of insomnia when consciousness cannot escape into sleep. We become aware of existence as such, being without beings, a rumbling presence that provides no comfort or meaning. Levinas described this as horrifying, an experience of being invaded by existence itself. The il-ia bears striking resemblance to Zapfe's cosmic panic, though Levinas developed different philosophical conclusions. For Levinas, the il-ia represents a problem that ethics and relationship with the other can address. The face-to-face encounter with another person calls us out of anonymous existence into responsibility. This ethical relation provides escape from the horror of impersonal being. Zapffe would reject this move as another anchoring mechanism. Ethics becomes way to avoid confronting that the il-ia, the sheer fairness of existence, has no justification or purpose. We anchor to moral responsibility because we cannot tolerate the alternative. Levinas tries to redeem existence through ethics. Zapffe sees ethics as one more desperate attempt to make existence bearable when it fundamentally is not. Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race appropriates and extends Zapfe's cosmic panic into full-scale horror metaphysics. Ligotti, primarily known as horror fiction writer, produced philosophical work arguing that consciousness is supernatural intrusion into natural world. He draws heavily on Zapffe while adding elements from supernatural horror and paranoid interpretation of reality. For Ligotti, the conspiracy is biological, psychological and social. All systems work together to prevent humans from recognizing that consciousness is cosmic accident or malicious joke. Ligotti's prose transforms Zapfe's clinical analysis into Gothic nightmare. But Ligotti's expansion of Zapffe may constitute reduction rather than development. By framing consciousness as conspiracy, Ligotti introduces narrative structure that Zapffe deliberately avoided. Conspiracy implies intentionality, agents working to deceive, coherent plot behind appearances. This provides a kind of meaning, even if that meaning is horrifying. Zapfe's cosmic panic contains no narrative. There is no conspiracy because that would require purpose. Consciousness is not hidden by malicious forces, but simply unbearable when confronted directly. Ligotti's Gothic elaboration may paradoxically make Zapfe's insight easier to digest by giving it narrative form. The conspiracy theory, even paranoid one, offers structure that cosmic panic lacks. Edmund Husserl's Phenomenology distinguished between predicative and pre-predicative experience. Predicative experience involves judgments, concepts, and linguistic articulation. Pre-predicative experience refers to primordial awareness before conceptual categorization. We encounter world pre-predicatively first, then impose concepts and language onto that raw experience. Zapfe's cosmic panic operates at pre-predicative level. It is not thought that existence is meaningless, which would be predicative judgment. Rather, it is direct encounter with meaninglessness as lived reality before any conceptualization. This phenomenological distinction proves crucial for understanding why cosmic panic resists cognitive therapy or rational argument. If panic operated at predicative level, we could challenge it through logical analysis. We might argue existence does have meaning, producing counter-evidence and philosophical arguments, but pre-predicative panic precedes any such discourse. It is foundational mood, what Heidegger called Stimmung, that shapes all subsequent experience and thought. Arguments for meaning occur within framework already structured by panic. They represent attempts to conceptually overcome what has already been pre-predicatively disclosed. This is why defense mechanisms must operate continuously. They do not refute panic, but simply prevent attention from settling on it. Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of nausea in his novel of the same name describes similar phenomenological state. The protagonist Roquentin experiences existence as contingent, unjustified, obscene in its sheer fairness. Objects lose their familiar meanings and appear as absurd presences. The nausea is not physical illness, but metaphysical vertigo, at confronting existence without essence. Sartre's nausea shares with Zapfe's panic the quality of being pre-reflective disclosure rather than conceptual conclusion. But Sartre moves toward existentialist ethics of freedom and authentic choice. Zapffe sees no possibility of redemption through authenticity. The nausea, the panic, reveals truth that admits no existentialist solution. Contemporary neuroscience of anxiety and panic might seem to reduce Zapfe's cosmic panic to neurochemical events. Panic attacks involve specific brain regions, neurotransmitter imbalances, and autonomic nervous system dysregulation. If cosmic panic is panic attack, then selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors might resolve what appears as philosophical problem. But this assumes biological explanation eliminates phenomenological validity. Even if panic has neurological substrate, this does not determine whether what is revealed in panic is true. The neurochemistry might be mechanism through which consciousness confronts its own impossibility. Treating the symptom does not address whether the symptom discloses reality. Medication might simply reinstall defense mechanisms that prevent recognition of truth. Zapfe's cosmic panic ultimately names the specific quality of horror that arises when consciousness fully recognizes itself. This is not existential crisis in therapeutic sense, temporary distress requiring counseling. It is permanent condition of consciousness that has exceeded its biological function. The panic reveals that every moment of continued existence requires active suppression of recognition. We are always already in crisis. Defense mechanisms do not solve crisis, but make it possible to not notice it continuously. Cosmic panic is what consciousness experiences when defenses temporarily fail, revealing the groundless abyss that was always there. The goal cannot be to eliminate panic, which would require eliminating consciousness itself. Instead, we construct ever more sophisticated ways to look away. Part 11. Linguistic Traps. Zapffe argued that language itself functions as defense mechanism, structuring thought in ways that prevent recognition of consciousness's catastrophic nature. The subject-predicate grammar of Indo-European languages creates illusion of stable selfhood. When we say "I think" or "I suffer," language suggests an I that exists independently of thinking and suffering. This grammatical structure generates substantive self where only process exists. Language builds defense mechanisms into syntax itself, making certain recognitions literally difficult to articulate. The subject-predicate structure divides reality into enduring substances that possess temporary properties. Tables have the property of being wooden. Humans have the property of being conscious. But this grammatical form distorts what it describes. Consciousness is not property a self possesses, but ongoing process that generates appearance of self. Language reverses the relationship, treating self as primary and consciousness as secondary. This linguistic structure provides comfort. It suggests we are stable beings who happen to be conscious rather than temporary condensations of consciousness that mistakenly believe in their own substantiality. Embodied cognition theories developed by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argue that abstract thought derives from bodily experience through metaphorical extension. Concepts like time use spatial metaphors because we experience our bodies moving through space. We speak of time as flowing, ideas as grasped, arguments as defended. These are not decorative language choices, but reveal how cognition builds abstract domains from concrete bodily schemas. Zapffel's linguistic analysis anticipates this framework, but draws opposite conclusions. Where Lakoff and Johnson celebrate embodied cognition as revealing thought's grounding in physical experience, Zapffe identifies this as source of delusion. If thought relies on bodily metaphors, then our understanding of existence remains trapped within biological perspective. We cannot think about consciousness except through concepts derived from organisms trying to survive. Purpose, meaning, value, significance, all these concepts extend from biological imperatives into domains where they do not apply. We ask what life means because organisms need goals to pursue. But existence itself has no goals. Language, built from embodied cognition, forces us to apply purposive concepts to purposeless reality. This creates permanent category error embedded in thought's basic structure. We literally cannot think the truth because language provides only false concepts. Ludwig Wittgenstein's later philosophy suggests that philosophical problems arise from language misleading us about reality. His therapeutic approach aims to dissolve pseudo-problems by revealing how grammar generates confusion. When we ask about the essence of mind or meaning of existence, we are seduced by linguistic forms into seeking substantial answers to grammatical questions. Wittgensteinian therapy shows how language goes on holiday, creating puzzles that disappear when we return to ordinary usage. This might seem to dissolve Zapffel's problems. Perhaps cosmic panic results from taking grammatical structures too seriously, mistaking linguistic forms for metaphysical truths. But Zapffel's linguistic pessimism resists Wittgensteinian dissolution. Wittgenstein assumes ordinary language works properly for ordinary life, that problems arise only when we philosophize. Zapffe argues ordinary language itself embeds defense mechanisms necessary for survival. The grammatical subject-predicate form is not neutral tool that occasionally misleads. It is active defense that constructs stable selfhood where none exists. Returning to ordinary usage does not solve the problem because ordinary usage is the problem. Language functions correctly precisely by systematically misrepresenting reality. Wittgenstein's therapy might eliminate philosophical confusion, but leaves intact the existential misrepresentation that makes life possible. Richard Rorty's linguistic pragmatism offers different response, suggesting we abandon metaphysical questions entirely. Rorty argues that there are no language-independent facts about reality to which our words must correspond. Instead, language is a tool we use to cope with environment and coordinate with others. From this perspective, asking whether language accurately represents consciousness becomes a confused question. Language serves purposes, and those purposes determine its adequacy. If subject-predicate grammar helps us navigate life, that is sufficient justification. Truth is not correspondence, but successful coping. Zapffe would see Rorty's pragmatism as most sophisticated form of distraction defense. By eliminating metaphysical questions about reality, pragmatism prevents recognition of consciousness's groundlessness. We focus on what works rather than what is. But this assumes working is sufficient goal, that successful coping justifies itself. Zapffe asks why we should cope at all. If consciousness is catastrophic error, then successful coping merely perpetuates mistake. Rorty's elimination of metaphysics is not philosophical progress but defensive maneuver. It removes from discourse precisely those questions that might reveal existence as unjustifiable. The problem extends beyond Indo-European languages to linguistic structure generally. Even languages with different grammatical organizations still divide experience into discrete units, impose categories, and create relationships. Some languages lack clear subject-predicate distinction, organizing sentences around verb complexes or topical structures. Yet they still generate stable concepts, repeatable meanings, and shareable frameworks. This suggests language as such, not specific grammatical forms, performs defensive function. By making experience articulable, language makes it manageable. We can talk about death, meaninglessness, and cosmic insignificance. But the very act of articulating these realities transforms them into objects of discourse rather than lived confrontations. Benjamin Lee Whorf's linguistic relativity hypothesis proposed that language shapes thought in fundamental ways. Different languages encode different ontologies, making certain concepts available while obscuring others. Whorf's strong version suggested we literally cannot think thoughts our language does not provide vocabulary for. This appears to support Zapffel's claim that language traps consciousness. But Whorf saw linguistic relativity as an interesting feature of human cognition, not existential tragedy. For Zapffe, the fact that language shapes thought means we cannot escape linguistic defenses even to recognize them fully. Every attempt to articulate the problem uses language that already contains the solution disguised as description. This creates paradox at the heart of Zapffel's own philosophical project. He uses language to argue that language prevents recognition of truth. He writes subject-predicate sentences claiming subject-predicate grammar is misleading. The critique employs the very structures it critiques. Zapffe recognized this performative contradiction, but saw no alternative. Silence would be more consistent, but would communicate nothing. Language must be used against itself, knowing that this usage remains trapped within what it opposes. The goal is not to escape language, but to momentarily loosen its grip, creating brief openings where recognition might occur. Then language reasserts itself, and the opening closes. Philosophy becomes a Sisyphean task of repeatedly trying to think what language prevents thinking. Part 12. Environmental Antinatalism. Zapffel's antinatalism intersects unexpectedly with environmental philosophy, generating what might be termed environmental antinatalism. If human consciousness produces unjustifiable suffering for humans themselves, it also inflicts catastrophic damage on all other forms of life. Human extinction would benefit not only humans by preventing future suffering, but the entire biosphere by removing its most destructive element. This creates dual justification for antinatalism, compassion toward potential humans and compassion toward non-human nature. Voluntary human extinction emerges as ultimate environmental ethic. Arne Naess, founder of Deep Ecology movement, knew Zapffe personally and engaged with his philosophy extensively. Deep ecology argues for biocentric equality, the view that all living beings have equal intrinsic value regardless of instrumental worth to humans. This leads to environmental ethics prioritizing ecosystem health over human preferences. Naess cited Zapffel's work but reached opposite conclusions. Where Zapffe saw human extinction as ethical imperative, Naess sought sustainable human presence within ecological constraints. Deep ecology affirms life, including human life properly integrated into natural systems. Zapffel's influence on Naess demonstrates how same philosophical premises can generate radically divergent conclusions. The divergence hinges on differing assessments of consciousness itself. Naess and deep ecologists accept consciousness as a valuable aspect of existence, something to preserve and expand. They seek wider identification, extending sense of self to include non-human nature. This expanded consciousness supposedly overcomes anthropocentrism and generates appropriate environmental concern. Zapffe viewed expanding consciousness as deepening tragedy. More awareness means more suffering, more recognition of existence's groundlessness. Identifying with all life means experiencing cosmic scale of meaningless suffering rather than just individual scale. Deep ecology inadvertently amplifies exactly what Zapffe identified as catastrophe. Environmental antinatalism presents strongest possible case for human extinction. Standard antinatalist arguments focus on suffering imposed on created beings themselves. Environmental version adds suffering imposed on countless other beings through human activity. Every human birth initiates chain of ecological destruction, species extinction, habitat loss and animal suffering. The carbon footprint of single human life extends across decades and geographical scales. From environmental antinatalist perspective, procreation becomes not only harm to created child, but violence toward entire biosphere. Each new human multiplies suffering across multiple dimensions and species boundaries. Murray Bookchin's social ecology provides critical counterpoint, arguing that environmental problems stem from hierarchical social structures, not humanity as such. Bookchin distinguished between first nature, the non-human world, and second nature, human culture and society. He argued that humanity's destructive relationship to first nature mirrors oppressive relationships within second nature. Domination of nature reflects and reinforces domination of humans by humans. The solution is not eliminating humanity, but transforming social organization toward non-hierarchical ecological communities. Bookchin explicitly criticized deep ecology as misanthropic, potentially eco-fascist in its implications. From Bookchin's perspective, environmental antinatalism represents ultimate misanthropy, condemning all humans for crimes of specific social systems. This arguably constitutes eco-fascism by proposing elimination of entire species as solution. Bookchin would argue that hierarchical capitalism, not humanity itself, drives ecological destruction. Different social organization could enable sustainable human presence. Environmental antinatalism forecloses possibility of social transformation by treating human nature as unchangeably destructive. This biological determinism, Bookchin might argue, serves reactionary political purposes by suggesting radical social change is pointless. But environmental antinatalists would respond that Bookchin's optimism about social transformation misses the depth of the problem. Even non-hierarchical ecological communities require resource consumption, habitat appropriation, and interference with non-human life. Humans cannot exist without environmental impact. The question is not whether we can live sustainably, but whether any level of impact is justifiable when the alternative is human absence. Second nature, regardless of its internal organization, necessarily imposes on first nature. Consciousness itself, not just hierarchical consciousness, generates needs that other beings must satisfy. From this view, even the most ecologically sensitive human society remains fundamentally extractive and destructive. The distinction between biocentric, ecocentric and anthropocentric antinatalism clarifies different environmental positions. Anthropocentric antinatalism argues against procreation based solely on harm to created humans. Biocentric antinatalism extends concern to individual non-human organisms harmed by human presence. Ecocentric antinatalism focuses on ecosystems and holistic environmental systems damaged by human activity. Each framework generates different ethical calculations. Biocentric view emphasizes individual animal suffering caused by human existence. Ecocentric view considers systemic disruption to natural processes. All three converge on antinatalist conclusion, but through different routes and with different priorities. David Benatar has extended his antinatalist arguments into environmental domain by calculating suffering humans impose on other species. His analysis includes factory farming, habitat destruction, climate change, and countless other harms. The total suffering humans cause to non-human animals vastly exceeds suffering experienced by humans themselves. This asymmetry strengthens antinatalist case. Even if one rejected arguments about human suffering being unjustifiable, the calculation of harm to other species might prove decisive. Procreation becomes not just questionable personal choice, but contribution to ongoing ecological catastrophe. Yet some environmental philosophers argue that human extinction would constitute tragedy for biosphere precisely because consciousness allows nature to know itself. Humans provide the universe with self-awareness, capacity to understand its own processes. Eliminating humanity would return universe to unconscious mechanism. From this perspective, consciousness, however problematic, represents valuable achievement worth preserving. Environmental antinatalists would counter that this romanticizes consciousness while ignoring its costs. Universe knowing itself through human consciousness means universe experiencing its own meaninglessness and suffering. Better for universe to proceed without such knowledge than to know itself through catastrophic awareness. Consciousness is not universe's achievement, but its mistake. Part 13. Time and Mortality. Zapfe's analysis of temporality and death diverges fundamentally from Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein. For Heidegger, being toward death structures authentic existence by revealing finitude as horizon of possibility. Death is not event that occurs at life's end, but existential structure that permeates every moment. Recognizing ourselves as being toward death supposedly enables authentic relationship to existence. We take responsibility for our finitude rather than fleeing into inauthentic modes of being. Death awareness allegedly generates meaning by forcing recognition of existence's limited possibilities. Zapffe rejected this entire framework as elaborate defense mechanism. Heidegger's being toward death transforms death from problem into solution, from source of horror into ground of authenticity. This transformation exemplifies sublimation at philosophical level. Death, which should provoke cosmic panic, becomes resource for meaning-making. Finitude, which reveals existence's ultimate pointlessness, supposedly provides structure that makes choices significant. Zapffe saw this as sophisticated avoidance. Death awareness does not enable authentic existence. It reveals that existence has no authentic mode, because consciousness itself is catastrophic error. Heidegger distinguished between authentic being toward death and inauthentic relation to mortality. Inauthentic Dasein treats death as something that happens to others eventually in general. We acknowledge that people die but avoid recognizing our own death as definite possibility. Authentic being toward death involves confronting death as my own most possibility, non-relational and certain. This confrontation supposedly individualizes Dasein, pulling us out of anonymous they-self into genuine selfhood. Anxiety before death reveals existence in its nakedness, stripped of everyday meanings and social roles. But for Zapffe, this anxiety reveals not possibility of authenticity, but impossibility of existence. What Heidegger interprets as individualization, Zapffe recognizes as isolation from all defense mechanisms. The anxiety is not call to authentic selfhood, but direct encounter with consciousness's unbearable nature. Heidegger tries to extract value from this encounter. Zapffe sees only confirmation that consciousness cannot sustain itself without defensive distortions. The difference between anxiety and cosmic panic becomes crucial. Anxiety, for Heidegger, discloses possibilities and calls for resolution into authentic existence. Cosmic panic discloses impossibility and calls for nothing except perhaps extinction. Epicurean arguments about death's irrelevance present classical challenge to death-based anxieties. Epicurus argued that death is nothing to us because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. We never encounter our own death. Therefore, fearing death is irrational. This argument aims to dissolve death anxiety by showing its object is incoherent. We fear something that will never be part of our experience. The Epicurean solution suggests we should focus on present pleasure and pain, ignoring what we will never experience. Zapffe would find Epicurean argument deeply inadequate. The problem is not fear of death as future event, but awareness of death as revealing existence's structure. Death matters not because we will experience it, but because recognizing it shows consciousness's fundamental predicament. We are organisms programmed to continue existing who can recognize that continuation has no justification. The Epicurean move of claiming death does not concern us, because we never experience it misses how death-awareness structures present existence. Even now, alive and conscious, we know we are temporary condensations that will dissolve. This knowledge cannot be dissolved through logical analysis of when death occurs. The problem is consciousness that can contemplate its own impossibility, not specific encounter with death. Heidegger's concept of temporal ecstasies describes how Dasein exists across past, present and future simultaneously. We are never simply present, but always already stretched across time. Past structures present through having been, future shapes present through anticipation. This ecstatic temporality supposedly enables authentic existence by allowing unified temporal grasp of life. We can take responsibility for who we have been and project towards possibilities ahead. Heidegger's temporality aims to show time as constitutive of meaningful existence rather than neutral container. Zapfe's analysis suggests temporal ecstasy creates temporal imprisonment. Consciousness stretched across time means suffering stretched across time. We experience not only present moment, but regret past decisions and dread future possibilities. Rather than enabling meaningful existence, temporal ecstasy multiplies points at which consciousness encounters its own impossibility. The past reveals contingency, the fact that we might never have existed. The future reveals mortality, the certainty that we will cease existing. The present reveals arbitrariness, that we have no justification for continuing. Heidegger's temporal ecstasy becomes existential torture chamber rather than ground of authenticity. Thomas Nagel argued that death is bad primarily because it deprives us of future goods we might have experienced. The badness of death consists in opportunity cost, experiences and pleasures we miss. This deprivation account suggests death's badness varies with what we lose. Death in old age after full life is less bad than death in youth with many possibilities unrealized. Nagel's position assumes life contains genuine goods worth having. Death is problem because it removes access to valuable experiences. From Zapfe's perspective, Nagel's deprivation account presupposes what needs questioning. If consciousness itself is catastrophic error, then future experiences are not goods but further suffering. Death deprives us of nothing valuable because continued consciousness has no value. The deprivation account assumes life contains positive content that death removes. Zapffe sees life as containing only defense mechanisms against recognizing its own groundlessness. Death ends the defensive operations, but this is not deprivation of goods. At most, death ends the need to defend against recognition. The tragedy is not that we die, but that we live, requiring continuous defensive effort until death finally provides relief. Contemporary terror management theory provides empirical support for defensive relationship to mortality. Research demonstrates that mortality salience activates worldview defense, increases adherence to cultural values, and strengthens self-esteem maintenance. When reminded of death, people cling more tightly to beliefs and identities that provide symbolic immortality. This suggests Zapffe was correct that death awareness triggers defensive mechanisms. But terror management theorists interpret defenses as adaptive, helping humans function despite death awareness. Zapffe sees the same defenses as preventing recognition that death reveals existence as unjustifiable. The empirical findings confirm defensive operations without determining whether defenses protect us from truth or from illusion. Part 14. The Reproduction Paradox. Zapffe identified procreation as supreme ethical violation, the act through which consciousness perpetuates its own catastrophic error. Parents impose existence on beings who cannot consent to it, creating new centers of awareness that will experience suffering without justification. This transforms every parent into unwitting torturer, regardless of intentions. The best possible life still requires defense mechanisms against existential recognition. Creating even a single new consciousness multiplies tragedy by adding another organism that must defend against its own awareness. The consent problem in procreation presents fundamental ethical paradox. All other significant impositions require consent from affected parties. Medical treatment, contractual obligations, physical contact each requires agreement from those involved. But procreation cannot satisfy this requirement. Non-existent beings cannot consent to existence. Parents make decisions affecting someone else with no possibility of prior agreement. This creates a unique ethical situation where standard moral frameworks seem to break down. Shiana Shiffrin developed sophisticated consent-based argument against procreation in her work on wrongful life. She argues that imposing serious risks on someone without their consent is prima facie wrong. Procreation necessarily imposes risks of suffering, disease, trauma, and death. These risks are serious enough that imposing them without consent would be impermissible in any other context. The fact that benefits might also occur does not justify unconsented risk imposition. We cannot justify harming someone without permission by claiming we also benefited them. Applied to procreation, this suggests creating life is ethically impermissible, regardless of quality of life provided. Elizabeth Harman's actual value approach attempts to rebut consent arguments by focusing on ex post evaluation. Harman argues that an action's permissibility depends on actual outcomes, not potential risks. If someone's life turns out well overall, then creating them was permissible. The impossibility of prior consent does not matter if actual life contains sufficient value. Harman claims we should evaluate procreation based on whether a created person has life worth living, not on consent frameworks. This shifts focus from procedural ethics to consequentialist assessment. But Zapfe's position undercuts Harman's actual value approach entirely. The claim that life can contain sufficient value to justify its imposition assumes life can have genuine positive value. If consciousness is biological catastrophe, then no life, however pleasant by conventional measures, contains value sufficient to justify creation. The happiest possible existence still requires continuous defense mechanisms against existential recognition. Evaluating life as worth living presupposes standard that Zapffe challenges. We call life worth living when defenses successfully prevent cosmic panic. But successful defense does not create value. It only prevents recognition that value is impossible for conscious beings. Julio Cabrera's negative ethics attempts to build ethical framework that acknowledges life's fundamental negativity without collapsing into nihilism. Cabrera argues that being born constitutes structural harm because existence inherently involves suffering, aging, and mortality. Every human being is fundamentally harmed by the mere fact of existing. Negative ethics accepts this but tries to derive moral obligations from shared situation of structural harm. We should minimize harm to others, because we all suffer from being brought into existence. Cabrera seeks ethics that acknowledges antinatalist insights without accepting complete ethical collapse. Zapffe might view Cabrera's negative ethics as another sophisticated anchoring mechanism. By deriving obligations from shared suffering, Cabrera creates moral framework that gives significance to existence. We now have duties to minimize harm, making life meaningful through ethical action. This transforms recognition of existence's negativity into resource for meaning-making. Zapffe would argue that genuine recognition of consciousness as catastrophe eliminates all frameworks, including negative ethical ones. There are no duties because duty presupposes value structure that consciousness's fundamental error destroys. Cabrera's attempt to save ethics from antinatalist conclusion shows how philosophy continuously tries to anchor itself even while acknowledging groundlessness. The distinction between ex-ante and ex-post evaluation proves crucial for reproduction ethics. Ex-ante evaluation considers permissibility before action based on what can be known at decision time. Ex-post evaluation judges permissibility after action based on actual outcomes. For procreation, this distinction generates completely different frameworks. Ex ante, we cannot know whether created being will have life worth living. We impose existence gambling on outcome. Ex post, we can evaluate whether that specific life turned out well. But this evaluation comes too late to guide initial decision. Zapfe's position operates at more fundamental level than either temporal perspective. Both ex ante and ex post evaluation assume possibility that life could have sufficient value to justify creation. They disagree about when to evaluate, but agree evaluation framework makes sense. Zapffe denies evaluative framework entirely. Consciousness cannot have net positive value under any circumstances because consciousness's very existence is the problem. No calculus of pleasure and pain, fulfillment and frustration, success and failure touches the core issue. We are organisms cursed with awareness that exceeds our psychological capacity. Every life, no matter how apparently successful, participates in this fundamental impossibility. Contemporary discussions of population ethics encounter similar conceptual challenges. How do we compare worlds with different numbers of people at different welfare levels? The repugnant conclusion suggests that world with enormous population at barely worth living level beats world with smaller population at much higher welfare. Philosophers disagree about whether to accept or reject this conclusion and what it implies for population policy. But these debates assume some lives can have positive value. Zapfe's antinatalism operates outside this framework. Every additional person, regardless of welfare level, represents additional catastrophe. Population ethics built on value aggregation misses that consciousness itself is disvalue that cannot be offset by any amount of pleasure or preference satisfaction. Part 15. Zapfe's legacy. Zapfe's influence on contemporary pessimism remains paradoxically invisible and pervasive. Most current pessimistic philosophy traces lineage through Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and Cioran, while overlooking Zapfe's more radical formulations. Yet his core insights about defense mechanisms and consciousness as biological error underpin much contemporary antinatalist and pessimistic thought. The framework he developed in relative obscurity during Norwegian isolation has become conceptual infrastructure for global pessimistic renaissance. Understanding this legacy requires examining how Zapfe's ideas transformed as they entered different philosophical traditions and unexpected domains. Silicon Valley transhumanism presents unexpected vindication of Zapfe's analysis through its desperate attempts to transcend biological consciousness. Figures like Ray Kurzweil propose uploading minds to digital substrates, eliminating biological limitations through technological singularity. Nick Bostrom's work on existential risk and superintelligence explores how consciousness might escape its current form. These projects appear optimistic, promising enhancement and transcendence. But Zapffe would recognize them as ultimate sublimation defense mechanisms operating at civilizational scale. Transhumanism acknowledges that current consciousness is unsustainable, then proposes technological escape rather than confronting that consciousness itself may be irredeemable. The techno-utopian dream of mind uploading represents most sophisticated attempt yet to solve consciousness through transformation rather than elimination. Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis demonstrates Zapfean recognition infiltrating mainstream philosophy. Bostrom argues that technological development might inevitably produce knowledge or capabilities that destroy civilizations. Some discoveries may be so dangerous that any society reaching them faces extinction. This framework acknowledges what Zapffe recognized, that consciousness generating unlimited knowledge creates existential threat. Bostrom proposes global surveillance and strict controls to prevent dangerous discoveries from being used. Zapffe would see this as confirming that consciousness cannot safely know everything it can know. The solution is not better control mechanisms, but recognizing that organisms capable of discovering everything should not exist. Vulnerable world hypothesis arrives at Zapffian conclusion while refusing to accept Zapffian solution. The debate between Thomas Ligotti and Eugene Thacker reveals tensions within contemporary Zapffian pessimism. Ligotti appropriates Zapffe for supernatural horror metaphysics, suggesting consciousness is malicious conspiracy. Thacker develops cosmic pessimism, emphasizing reality's indifference to human meaning-making. Both draw on Zapffe but diverge significantly. Ligotti's conspiracy framework introduces intentionality and narrative structure that Zapffe avoided. Thacker's cosmic scale risks losing Zapfe's focus on biological and psychological specificity. The disagreement reflects deeper question about whether pessimism should remain phenomenological, describing lived experience of despair, or become metaphysical, making claims about reality's ultimate nature. Zapffe himself operated at intersection, using phenomenology to support metaphysical conclusions about consciousness. David Benatar versus Rivka Weinberg represents contemporary antinatalist debate heir to Zapfe's Reproduction Paradox. Benatar's asymmetry argument provides formal logical structure for antinatalist position. Weinberg's risk-based procreative ethics attempts to preserve permissibility of procreation within consent frameworks. But both operate within philosophical territory Zapffe mapped. The question is whether Benatar's formalization strengthens or weakens Zapfe's intuition. Formal argument makes antinatalism academically respectable, but potentially loses visceral recognition of consciousness as catastrophe. Weinberg's challenges force precision about what exactly makes procreation wrong. Is it consent violation, harm, imposition, or something deeper about consciousness itself? Zapfe's legacy appears in how contemporary debate structures itself around questions he first articulated. Arne Nice versus Murray Bookchin on environmental implications demonstrates political stakes of Zapfe's influence. Nice incorporated Zapffe while developing life-affirming deep ecology. Bookchin saw misanthropic potential in any philosophy, suggesting human extinction as solution. The debate concerns whether environmental ethics can acknowledge humanity as ecological catastrophe without embracing eco-fascism. Zapffe provides vocabulary for expressing human destructiveness, but lacks political framework for response. His philosophy describes problem without offering reform, only termination. This makes Zapffe simultaneously essential and dangerous for environmental thought. Essential because he articulates human impact's existential dimensions. Dangerous because his logic leads toward conclusions incompatible with progressive politics. Thomas Metzinger versus Antonio Damasio on consciousness as error reveals neurophilosophical dimension of Zapfe's legacy. Metzinger's phenomenal self-model theory suggests consciousness constructs fictional self through transparent modeling. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis shows how consciousness integrates bodily states with cognitive processing. Both frameworks, from different angles, support Zapfe's claim that consciousness exceeds functional requirements. Metzinger demonstrates how self-awareness involves systematic self-deception. Damasio reveals how emotional tagging of representations creates vulnerability when applied to existential recognition. Contemporary neurophilosophy provides mechanisms explaining what Zapffe described phenomenologically. The question becomes whether understanding mechanisms dissolves or deepens the problem. Nick Land versus Ray Brassier represents accelerationist and eliminativist responses to Zapffian pessimism. Land's accelerationism suggests we should intensify capitalist and technological processes toward inevitable collapse. If consciousness is unsustainable, accelerate its contradictions rather than resist them. Brassier's eliminative materialism argues consciousness can recognize its own contingency and meaninglessness without defensive reaction. Brassier seeks what he calls solar catastrophe, full recognition of extinction without recoiling into meaning-making. Land embraces destruction as productive force. Brassier demands recognition without amelioration. Both radicalize Zapffe, but in opposite directions, one toward active acceleration, other toward passive acknowledgement. The appropriation of Zapffe by extinction studies and critical death studies creates academic legitimization while potentially domesticating his insights. Scholars analyze human extinction as theoretical possibility, climate catastrophe as existential threat, death as biopolitical phenomenon. These frameworks treat Zapffe as resource for thinking about endings. But academic discourse necessarily sublimate what it examines, converting existential threats into research topics. Publishing papers about human extinction in peer-reviewed journals exemplifies sublimation defense operating at disciplinary level. The horror becomes curriculum, despair becomes conference theme, extinction becomes expertise. Zapffel's recognition that academia itself functions as defense mechanism applies to academic study of Zapffe. The more his work enters scholarly discourse, the more it becomes neutralized through institutional processing. Contemporary pessimism's popularization through online forums and social media creates strange vindication and betrayal simultaneously. Zapffel's ideas circulate through digital networks reaching global audience he never imagined. Reddit communities discuss antinatalism, Twitter threads analyze defense mechanisms, YouTube videos explain cosmic panic. This democratization spreads pessimistic philosophy beyond academic gatekeepers. But digital platforms themselves exemplify distraction defense at unprecedented scale. People scroll through posts about how distraction prevents existential recognition while being distracted by the scrolling itself. Zapffe goes viral precisely by becoming content within attention economy he predicted. The medium undermines the message even while transmitting it. Speculative realism's great outdoors versus Zapffel's great indoors of consciousness represents fundamental metaphysical disagreement within post-continental philosophy. Speculative realists like Quentin Meillassoux argue philosophy must think reality independent of human access. They seek to escape correlationism, the idea that we can only know reality through our relationship to it. The great outdoors names reality untouched by human thought. Zapffel's position implies opposite movement toward what might be called the great indoors. Consciousness cannot escape itself to access reality directly because consciousness is the problem, not the solution. We are trapped in phenomenological interiority that cannot be resolved through speculative metaphysics. Speculative realism wants to think beyond human thought. Zapffe suggests human thought wants to escape itself but cannot. Both recognize limitation but propose incompatible responses. Part 16. The Writing Paradox. Zapffel's extensive philosophical output creates performative contradiction at the heart of his project. He produced over 50,000 words arguing that existence has no justification and consciousness should recognize this truth. But writing philosophy presupposes numerous commitments that contradict pessimistic conclusions. It assumes communication is possible, that arguments matter, that changing minds has value. Most fundamentally, writing requires caring enough about ideas to dedicate life to articulating them. Zapffe devoted decades to philosophy while arguing devotion to anything represents defense mechanism. This generates what might be termed the pessimist's performative paradox, performing exactly what the performance denies. The paradox operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At epistemic level, Zapffe claims language itself functions as defense mechanism that prevents recognition of truth. Yet he uses language extensively to communicate this claim. At practical level, he argues consciousness should recognize its own catastrophic nature and cease reproducing. Yet he writes to convince conscious beings of this, implicitly valuing their recognition. At existential level, he describes all activity as distraction from cosmic panic. Yet philosophical writing constitutes sustained activity requiring intense focus and dedication. Each dimension of his work contradicts claims the work defends. Emile Cioran's aphoristic solution represents one response to performative contradiction in pessimistic philosophy. Cioran wrote in fragments brief pensées that avoid systematic development. The aphorism acknowledges futility of extended argument while still communicating despair. By refusing to build comprehensive philosophical systems, Cioran's style matches his content. If existence is meaningless, then systematic philosophy pretending to meaning becomes obscene. Aphorisms capture recognition in flashes without claiming to construct anything enduring. Cioran's form admits its own inadequacy, performing pessimism through stylistic fragmentation. Zapffe chose opposite approach, developing systematic analysis across multiple essays and lectures. His magnum work, Homme des Tragisques, presents comprehensive theory of human consciousness and defense mechanisms. The systematic form suggests confidence in rational analysis and argumentative development. But systematic philosophy inherently claims to grasp its subject matter adequately. It proposes frameworks, develops implications, anticipates objections. All this activity presumes that philosophical understanding matters, that conceptual clarity provides something valuable. Zapfe's systematic approach thus contradicts pessimistic content more thoroughly than Cioran's aphorisms. The very comprehensiveness of his analysis testifies to philosophical investment his conclusions should undermine. Jürgen Habermas argues that performative contradictions reveal positions as philosophically untenable. If what you do in making a claim contradicts the content of the claim, the position refutes itself. Habermas uses this against relativists who assert there is no truth while implicitly claiming their assertion is true. Applied to Zapffe, writing extensively about meaninglessness seems to demonstrate that articulating ideas has meaning. The performance undermines the thesis. If Zapffe truly believed existence lacked justification, silence would be more consistent than 50,000 words. From Habermasian perspective, pessimistic philosophy defeats itself through its own articulation. But this critique assumes performative consistency provides criterion of philosophical adequacy. Zapffe might respond that consciousness itself is performative contradiction, organism that cannot justify its own existence yet continues existing. Human life inherently performs contradiction between biological imperatives and cognitive recognition. Philosophical writing about this simply mirrors at discursive level what happens at existential level. The contradiction is not flaw in argument, but accurate representation of consciousness's impossible situation. We cannot help but care about ideas, even when ideas reveal that caring lacks foundation. Philosophical writing becomes one more defense mechanism, sublimating cosmic panic into intellectual production. Zapffe acknowledges this while doing it anyway because consciousness permits no escape from its own operations. The distinction between pragmatic and semantic inconsistency clarifies different types of performative contradiction. Semantic inconsistency occurs when statement's content contradicts itself logically. This statement is false generates semantic paradox. Pragmatic inconsistency occurs when act of stating contradicts what is stated. "I am not speaking" is pragmatically inconsistent when spoken aloud. Zapfe's philosophical writing involves pragmatic rather than semantic inconsistency. The claims themselves may be logically coherent. The inconsistency appears in relationship between making claims and content of claims made. Whether pragmatic inconsistency undermines philosophical positions depends on one's metaphilosophical commitments. If philosophy aims at theoretical truth independent of practical concerns, pragmatic inconsistency may be irrelevant. The ideas could be correct even if holding them creates practical contradictions. But if philosophy essentially involves practical dimension, linking thought to life, then pragmatic inconsistency becomes devastating. Zapfe's position seems to require practical dimension because it concerns how consciousness should respond to recognizing its own nature. This makes performative contradiction more problematic than mere theoretical observation would. He prescribes response while performing different response through active prescription. Ludwig Wittgenstein's ladder metaphor from Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus offers possible framework for understanding Zapfe's paradox. Wittgenstein writes that his propositions are nonsensical but must be used to reach understanding, then thrown away like ladder after climbing. One uses language to show what language cannot say, then recognizes that the very attempt was confused. Perhaps Zapfe's writing functions similarly as ladder toward recognition that cannot be directly stated. The arguments lead consciousness toward seeing its own impossibility, after which arguments themselves dissolve as unnecessary. But this interpretation assumes possibility of recognition beyond language. Zapfe's analysis suggests consciousness never escapes linguistic defense mechanisms. There is no position outside from which to throw away ladder. Some readers interpret Zapfe's writing as intentionally self-undermining, performing the impossibility of philosophical resolution. By writing himself into contradictions, he demonstrates that consciousness cannot achieve consistent position. The contradictions are not failures, but illustrations of consciousness's predicament. We cannot avoid activity even when recognizing activity as defense mechanism. We cannot remain silent because silence itself becomes activity, deliberate withdrawal that affirms what it denies. From this perspective, Zapfe's writing succeeds precisely by failing to resolve its own performative tensions. The work models consciousness attempting to grasp itself and discovering that grasp is impossible. Philosophy becomes pedagogical performance of its own impossibility. Yet this sophisticated reading may itself constitute sublimation defense. By interpreting contradictions as intentional illustrations, we transform failures into successes. The writing that should undermine itself becomes admired for its self-undermining. We appreciate Zapfe's performative contradictions as philosophically profound. This converts existential impossibility into aesthetic achievement. The recognition that gets sublimated into writing gets further sublimated into academic interpretation, praising the sublimation. Each level of analysis adds new defensive layer. Perhaps the only consistent response to Zapffe would be stopping at initial recognition without writing, interpreting, or discussing. But then his work would disappear entirely, having no cultural existence. The paradox is that Zapfe's philosophy requires transmission to have impact, but transmission contradicts what gets transmitted. Part 17. Existential Mathematics. Zapfe's philosophy implies what might be called existential mathematics, formal structure to consciousness's impossible accounting. Every moment of consciousness involves calculation that cannot balance. Biological imperatives demand continuation. Cognitive recognition reveals continuation lacks justification. Psychological capacity cannot sustain full awareness of this contradiction. The mathematics of existence produces equations with no solutions, only temporary approximations through defense mechanisms. Understanding this formal structure illuminates why consciousness generates suffering necessarily rather than contingently. The asymmetry between existence and non-existence creates foundational imbalance in existential calculation. Non-existent beings have no interest, experience no deprivation, suffer no harm. Existent beings necessarily have interests that can be frustrated, experience deprivations, suffer inevitable harms. This generates what David Benatar formalized as axiological asymmetry. Presence of pleasure is good, presence of pain is bad, absence of pain is good, but absence of pleasure is not bad when no one exists to be deprived. The matrix is structurally unbalanced, systematically favoring non-existence over existence. Zapffe recognized this asymmetry phenomenologically before Benatar provided formal articulation. But Zapfe's existential mathematics goes deeper than axiological asymmetry about pleasure and pain. The calculation involves relationship between cognitive capacity and psychological tolerance. Let C represent cognitive capacity for recognition, T represent psychological tolerance for recognition. For most organisms, C remains safely below T. They can recognize what they need to recognize without exceeding what they can psychologically process. For humans, C exceeds T by catastrophic margin. We can recognize cosmic meaninglessness, mortality, contingency, but we cannot tolerate sustained recognition. This creates permanent deficit that defense mechanisms attempt to manage without resolving. The equation C minus T equals D, where D represents defensive requirement, the amount of psychological operation needed to prevent breakdown. The mathematics reveals why improving conditions does not solve existential problem. We might increase psychological tolerance through therapy, medication, or supportive environment. But cognitive capacity increases correspondingly or exceeds any tolerance gains. More awareness of therapeutic frameworks means more recognition that frameworks are defensive constructions. Better living conditions reduce immediate suffering but create space for existential recognition to emerge. This explains Zapfe's observation that existential crisis appears most acutely in comfortable circumstances. When survival needs are met, consciousness confronts its own groundlessness without distraction of immediate threats. The existential mathematics thus predicts that progress in life quality intensifies rather than alleviates the fundamental problem. Temporal dimensions add further complexity to existential accounting. Each moment of consciousness involves not just present experience, but anticipation and retrospection. Past moments accumulate as weight of decisions made, paths taken, possibilities foreclosed. Future moments loom as certainties like death and uncertainties that generate anxiety. The temporal structure multiplies points at which consciousness must defend against recognition. If we consider n moments of consciousness across lifetime, and each moment requires defensive operation D, then total defensive effort equals n times D. This sum represents aggregate psychological labor required just to sustain consciousness across time. The longer life continues, the greater the defensive burden becomes. Recursive structure of self-awareness introduces exponential complexity into existential mathematics. Consciousness can be aware of being aware, then aware of that awareness, ascending potentially infinite hierarchy. Each level of meta-awareness introduces new opportunity for recognition and new requirement for defense. First-order awareness might recognize mortality. Second-order awareness recognizes that one recognizes mortality and finds this recognition disturbing. Third-order awareness recognizes the finding disturbing and questions why disturbance occurs. The recursive structure means defensive operations must address not just initial recognition, but all meta-levels of recognition about recognition. This generates exponential growth in defensive requirement as consciousness reflects on itself. The concept of defensive equilibrium describes unstable balance consciousness achieves through mechanisms. Equilibrium requires that defensive operations successfully prevent existential recognition from overwhelming psychological capacity. But this balance is dynamic, constantly threatened by novel recognitions and deteriorating defenses. Aging weakens certain defense mechanisms while experience strengthens certain recognitions. Isolation becomes harder to maintain as information proliferates. Anchors lose effectiveness as we recognize their arbitrary nature. Distraction provides diminishing returns as we habituate to stimulation. Sublimation exhausts itself as we recognize aesthetic production as defense. The mathematics predicts that defensive equilibrium becomes increasingly difficult to maintain across lifespan, explaining why existential crisis often intensifies with age despite greater life experience. Game-theoretic analysis reveals consciousness as multiplayer game against itself. Different cognitive subsystems have competing objectives. Recognition subsystem seeks truth regardless of consequences. Preservation subsystem seeks psychological survival regardless of truth. These subsystems cannot both win simultaneously. Full recognition destroys psychological capacity. Full preservation requires systematic self-deception. The game has no Nash equilibrium, no stable solution where all subsystems achieve optimal outcomes. Defense mechanisms represent attempts to negotiate impossible game, choosing preservation over recognition while allowing enough recognition to maintain intellectual coherence. Information theory provides framework for understanding consciousness as managing unbearable information. Shannon entropy measures information content in bits. Existential information has maximum entropy because it admits no compression or simplification. Mortality, meaninglessness, cosmic indifference cannot be encoded more efficiently. They must be confronted in full or not confronted at all. Defense mechanisms function as lossy compression algorithms, reducing information content to manageable levels at cost of accuracy. Isolation drops information entirely. Anchoring compresses meaninglessness into false meaning structures. Distraction fragments information across time. Sublimation transforms information into different format. Each compression strategy loses essential content while making information psychologically processable. The existential mathematics ultimately demonstrates formal impossibility of conscious existence achieving stability. Every calculation reveals deficits, asymmetries, recursive instabilities, and equilibria that cannot hold. Consciousness is organism attempting to solve equations that have no solutions. We keep calculating, adjusting, defending, hoping to reach balance that mathematics proves impossible. This formal structure suggests Zapffel's pessimism is not temperamental disposition or cultural artifact, but logical conclusion from consciousness's mathematical properties. The suffering is not contingent feature that better circumstances could eliminate. It follows necessarily from formal relationships between recognition, tolerance, and time. Existential mathematics reveals consciousness as attempting perpetual motion, seeking stable operation while violating thermodynamic principles that govern psychological possibility. Part 18. The Phenomenology of Relief. Zapfe's analysis of defense mechanisms implicitly describes phenomenology of relief, the specific quality of experience when consciousness temporarily escapes its own burden. Relief is not mere absence of suffering, but positive recognition that defensive operations have succeeded. We feel relief when isolation prevents disturbing information from entering awareness, when anchoring provides stable meaning, when distraction occupies attention completely, when sublimation transforms horror into beauty. Understanding relief's phenomenology reveals how consciousness rewards its own defensive success, creating feedback loops that reinforce mechanisms even as they prevent recognition. The feeling of relief becomes evidence that defenses are necessary, that consciousness cannot function without them. Relief manifests different qualities depending on which defense mechanism produces it. Isolation generates relief as absence, the satisfying sense that disturbing possibilities have been excluded. We feel relieved that we do not have to think about distant suffering, ecological catastrophe, or cosmic indifference. This relief has negative character, defined by what it keeps out rather than what it provides. The phenomenology resembles closing door against storm, satisfaction of barrier holding. We do not experience what we are isolated from, only the comfort of isolation itself. This makes isolated consciousness feel safe, properly bounded, protected from excessive awareness. Anchoring produces relief as stability, feeling of standing on solid ground. When we anchor to nation, family, career, or ideology, consciousness experiences itself as having foundation. The relief comes from sense that existence means something, that our concerns matter, that actions have significance. This phenomenology differs markedly from isolation's absence. Anchoring relief is positive presence, felt meaningfulness that seems to justify continued existence. We experience ourselves as part of something larger, connected to values and purposes that transcend individual mortality. The relief feels like arriving home, finding place where consciousness belongs. But Zapffe recognized this homecoming as illusion, temporary stabilization of what remains fundamentally groundless. Distraction creates relief as absorption, the experience of being completely occupied. When consciousness fills itself with activity, planning, entertainment, or stimulation, it feels release from self-reflection. The relief manifests as flow state, where awareness loses track of itself in engagement with tasks or experiences. Time seems to pass quickly, self-consciousness dissolves, existential questions never arise. This phenomenology resembles intoxication, not from substances but from sheer activity. Consciousness gets drunk on its own busyness, relieved precisely because it cannot attend to its own condition. The modern addiction to productivity and stimulation makes sense as pursuit of this absorptive relief. We stay busy because busyness provides temporary escape from recognition. Sublimation generates relief as mastery, feeling of having transformed suffering into achievement. The artist who creates work from existential recognition experiences relief as creative success. Horror becomes material, meaninglessness becomes theme, despair becomes aesthetic object. This relief has quality of control, sense that consciousness has grasped what threatens it and made something from the confrontation. The phenomenology resembles alchemy, base suffering supposedly transmuted into golden achievement. We feel relieved because artistic production suggests that recognition need not destroy, that consciousness can somehow contain what exceeds it. But Zapffe understood this relief as most deceptive because it convinces us we have solved what remains unsolved. Sublimation relieves by creating illusion of having adequately responded to recognition that admits no adequate response. The temporal structure of relief reveals its fundamentally defensive character. Relief never persists permanently but requires constant renewal through ongoing defensive operations. We cannot isolate once and remain isolated. New information constantly threatens boundaries we've drawn. Anchors do not hold indefinitely, but require active maintenance and recommitment. Distraction exhausts itself, demanding ever new sources of absorption. Sublimation produces objects that then join the world, no longer providing relief to their creator. The transience of relief indicates that consciousness is not actually defending against external threats, but against itself. The enemy is internal recognition that keeps returning regardless of defensive success. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety as dizziness of freedom provides comparative framework for understanding relief. Kierkegaard saw anxiety arising from confronting possibility, the vertiginous recognition that we must choose without ultimate justification. Relief, in Kierkegaardian terms, would be escape from this vertigo into false necessity. We convince ourselves that certain choices are demanded, certain paths unavoidable, certain meanings given rather than chosen. This relief is flight from freedom into determinism. But Zapfe's phenomenology differs because the vertigo is not about freedom, but about groundlessness of consciousness itself. Relief comes from avoiding recognition that freedom and determinism are equally groundless categories imposed by consciousness that cannot justify its own existence. Kierkegaard's anxiety at least suggests authentic response through passionate commitment. Zapfe's cosmic panic admits no authentic response, only defensive relief that acknowledges its own inadequacy. The paradox of relief is that it simultaneously confirms and denies what it defends against. By providing relief, defense mechanisms demonstrate that something threatening exists. We would not need relief if consciousness could tolerate full recognition without defending. Each moment of relief testifies to unbearable nature of what consciousness must avoid. Yet relief also denies this by creating experience of successful escape. The phenomenology suggests we have solved the problem when we have only managed to look away. This double movement, confirming threat while denying its significance, characterizes relief's essential structure. We feel good precisely because we are successfully not recognizing what would destroy the feeling good. Contemporary wellness culture industrializes relief, marketing defensive operations as self-care. Mindfulness apps provide distraction relief packaged as spiritual practice. Positive psychology offers anchoring relief disguised as empirical science. Digital detoxes sell isolation relief as lifestyle choice. Creative hobbies promise sublimation relief, framed as personal development. Each intervention correctly identifies defensive need while misrepresenting what gets defended against. We are told that relief techniques address stress, anxiety, burnout, as if these were contingent conditions rather than consciousness's permanent predicament. The commodification of relief demonstrates society-wide recognition that consciousness requires continuous defensive support. But commercial framework prevents recognition that no amount of wellness can address consciousness as biological catastrophe. Zapfe's own experience of relief in mountaineering reveals defense mechanisms' inevitability even for those who recognize them. He knew climbing provided temporary relief from existential burden through physical intensity and immediate danger. Yet he climbed anyway, requiring the relief despite philosophical recognition of its defensive character. This suggests consciousness cannot function on pure recognition alone. Even philosophers who understand defense mechanisms must employ them to continue existing. The Phenomenology of Relief operates below voluntary control. We experience relief whether or not we believe it represents genuine solution. This involuntary quality demonstrates how deeply defensive operations are embedded in consciousness's structure. Relief is not choice but necessity, not solution but temporary suspension of impossible situation. Part 19. Collective Consciousness and Mass Defense. Zapfe's analysis primarily addresses individual consciousness, but his framework extends to collective formations where defense mechanisms operate at social and civilizational scales. Societies develop shared defensive structures that coordinate individual defense mechanisms into collective projects. Nationalism provides mass anchoring. Entertainment industries enable collective distraction. Cultural production facilitates societal sublimation, and institutional information control implements systematic isolation. Understanding collective defense reveals how civilization itself functions as elaborate mechanism, preventing mass existential recognition that would destabilize social reproduction. The question becomes whether collective defense operates more or less successfully than individual attempts at managing consciousness. Religious institutions exemplify collective anchoring at largest historical scale. Religion provides shared meaning structures that billions of individuals anchor to simultaneously. Gods, afterlives, cosmic purposes and moral frameworks offer collective solutions to existential groundlessness. Durkheim recognized that religious belief reinforces social solidarity, but Zapffe would identify more fundamental function. Religion coordinates defensive operations across populations, ensuring that individuals do not each face cosmic panic in isolation. Shared beliefs create mutual reinforcement where each person's anchoring strengthens others' anchoring. The collective dimension makes religious defense more robust than individual meaning-making. When everyone around you confirms that existence has purpose, sustaining personal belief becomes easier. Religion's historical dominance reflects its effectiveness at collective defense rather than its truth. The decline of traditional religion in modern societies creates defensive crises requiring new collective mechanisms. When shared religious frameworks collapse, societies must generate alternative mass anchoring structures. Nationalism, political ideology, consumer identity, and technological progress narratives emerge as secular replacements. Each provides collective meaning without supernatural commitments. We anchor to national identity, feeling that citizenship gives life significance. We anchor to political movements, believing that justice and progress justify existence. We anchor to consumer culture, experiencing personal identity through products and lifestyles. We anchor to technological narratives, trusting that innovation creates better futures. These secular anchors attempt collective defense previously provided by religion, with varying degrees of success and stability. Mass media represents industrialized distraction operating at civilizational level. Television, internet, social media, and entertainment complexes generate continuous content flow, preventing collective existential reflection. Modern societies produce distraction as primary cultural output. The content matters less than the function of occupying attention continuously. News cycles, streaming services, viral trends, and algorithmic feeds ensure that consciousness never lacks something to attend to. This collective distraction proves more powerful than individual attempts because it operates as environmental condition. We do not choose distraction from limited personal options. We swim in ocean of distraction that surrounds us as atmospheric pressure. Opting out requires active resistance against default conditions of contemporary existence. Totalitarian regimes demonstrate how collective defense mechanisms can be weaponized for political control. Fascism and Stalinism provided total anchoring systems demanding absolute commitment to state ideology. Every aspect of life received meaning through relationship to collective project. Citizens anchored to nation, party, leader, or historical destiny with religious intensity. These systems recognized that populations require existential anchoring and monopolized its provision. By controlling all meaning structures, totalitarian states prevented alternative anchors from emerging. Hannah Arendt analyzed this as elimination of private sphere, but Zapffe would recognize it as perfecting collective defense. Totalitarianism succeeds by providing comprehensive answer to existential groundlessness, however horrifying that answer proves in practice. Democratic consumer societies employ more sophisticated collective defense by offering anchoring diversity. Rather than imposing single meaning structure, these societies provide marketplace of anchors. Citizens choose personal combinations of national identity, political affiliation, consumer preferences, career aspirations, and lifestyle commitments. The diversity creates illusion of freedom while maintaining defensive function. We feel autonomous selecting our anchors from available options. But the selection itself, regardless of specific choices, performs defensive operation. Liberal societies succeed at collective defense precisely by personalizing it, making each individual responsible for constructing defensive structure from collective resources. This distributes defensive burden while maintaining social coordination through shared participation in anchoring marketplace. Educational institutions perform collective isolation by controlling which recognitions enter mass consciousness. Curricula determine what knowledge receives attention, which questions get asked, which frameworks structure thinking. Schools teach history, science, literature, and philosophy in ways that maintain social reproduction. Education certainly provides genuine knowledge and critical thinking skills. But institutional structure ensures certain recognitions remain marginal or excluded entirely. Zapffe analysis of consciousness as biological catastrophe does not feature in standard education. Antinatalism, cosmic pessimism, and radical critiques of existence occupy peripheral positions if they appear at all. This isolation operates not through censorship, but through curricular choices that appear natural and neutral. Collective isolation succeeds by making exclusions invisible. Art and culture industries enable collective sublimation, transforming societal suffering into aesthetic objects for mass consumption. Films, novels, music, and visual arts process existential themes into entertainment. Contemporary culture is saturated with content addressing meaninglessness, mortality, and alienation. But this content circulates as cultural product rather than direct existential confrontation. We consume art about despair without experiencing despair, watch films about meaninglessness while anchoring meaning to narrative experience. Collective sublimation makes existential recognition available as aesthetic experience, defanging recognition by converting it into culture. The artist sublimates individual suffering into work, then audiences sublimate recognition by consuming work as art. Layers of sublimation protect society from direct encounter with what art supposedly expresses. Climate crisis reveals collective defense mechanisms failing at civilizational scale. Scientific recognition of ecological catastrophe should trigger societal transformation. Yet collective response remains inadequate despite clear evidence and urgent necessity. Zapfe's framework explains this paralysis. Climate change confronts humanity with its own unsustainability, forcing recognition that current civilization cannot continue. This existential threat activates defensive mechanisms at collective level. Societies isolate by denying or downplaying evidence. They anchor to narratives of technological salvation or economic growth as solution. They distract through endless debates and competing priorities. They sublimate by converting crisis into cultural content, films and novels about apocalypse. Collective defense prevents societal response adequate to threat precisely because adequate response would require abandoning defensive structures that make civilization psychologically possible. The question arises whether collective consciousness could achieve what individual consciousness cannot. Perhaps society could sustain existential recognition that destroys individuals. Distributed across population, cosmic panic might become manageable. Collective rationality might override individual defensive needs. But Zapfe's analysis suggests opposite. Collective defense mechanisms amplify rather than resolve individual impossibility. Societies consist of individuals who each require defense against recognition. Aggregating defensive needs creates systems optimized for mass avoidance rather than mass recognition. Collective consciousness does not transcend individual limitation but institutionalizes it. Civilization becomes coordinated defense mechanism, elaborate social technology for preventing species-wide existential reckoning. Part 20. The Silence After Philosophy. Zapfe's philosophy points toward its own dissolution, suggesting that ultimate consistency requires abandoning philosophy itself. If language functions as defense mechanism, if systematic thought represents sublimation, if arguments presuppose values that consciousness cannot sustain, then philosophy must eventually encounter its own limits. The question becomes what lies beyond or after philosophy for consciousness that has recognized its own impossibility. This is not about finding new philosophical frameworks, but about confronting the silence that philosophy tries to fill. Zapfe's work prepares us for recognition that philosophy itself may be obstacle to recognition philosophy seeks. Mystical traditions across cultures describe experiences beyond conceptual articulation. Meister Eckhart's Godhead Beyond God, Zen Buddhism's Satori, Advaita Vedanta's Nirvikalpa Samadhi, all point towards states where consciousness transcends its own structure. These traditions suggest language and thought are barriers rather than paths to ultimate recognition. Zapfe's analysis might seem to converge with mysticism, both identifying conceptual thought as problem. But crucial difference remains. Mysticism promises liberation, enlightenment, or union beyond thought. Zapffe offers no liberation, only recognition that consciousness is trap without exit. Mystical silence supposedly reveals truth that redeems existence. Zapfean silence would reveal only that consciousness has no foundation and redemption is impossible. The via negativa in theological tradition proceeds by negating attributes of God, approaching divine reality through stating what it is not. God is not finite, not temporal, not material, not comprehensible. Each negation supposedly brings us closer to truth that cannot be stated positively. Zapfe's method resembles via negativa applied to consciousness itself. Consciousness is not justified, not meaningful, not sustainable, not transcendent. But where theological via negativa culminates in mystical affirmation beyond negation, Zapffian via negativa ends in sheer absence. The negations do not reveal hidden positive truth. They simply clear away illusions, leaving consciousness confronting its own groundlessness without resolution. Wittgenstein's conclusion to Tractatus states that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This suggests that some realities exceed linguistic expression and should not be forced into propositions. Silence becomes appropriate response when language reaches its limits. But Wittgenstein's silence has therapeutic intent. By remaining silent about what cannot be said, we avoid philosophical confusion. We return to ordinary life and language games that function properly within their domains. Zapffel's silence would have different character. It is not therapeutic return to ordinary functioning, but acknowledgement that consciousness has no proper functioning. Silence does not resolve problems, but marks where problems reveal themselves as unsolvable. Heidegger's later philosophy emphasizes listening to being's silence, attending to what withdraws rather than forcing presence. He suggests authentic thinking requires letting being reveal itself rather than imposing conceptual frameworks. This seems to advocate silence as philosophical method, waiting in openness for disclosure. But Heidegger maintains that being's withdrawal still gives something, still provides ground for thinking. Zapffel's silence offers no ground. There is nothing to listen to because consciousness's recognition reveals absence of any voice or disclosure. Heideggerian silence remains within horizon of meaning, trusting that being provides if we attend properly. Zapffian silence acknowledges that consciousness listens to nothing, that the seeming voices are internal defense mechanisms preventing recognition of absolute silence. The contemporary philosophy of silence, developed by figures like Bernard Dauenhauer, examines how silence functions in communication and experience. Silence has meanings, carries messages, structures discourse. Pauses between words, refusal to speak, contemplative quiet, each silence means something within context. This philosophical analysis treats silence as phenomenon to be understood conceptually. But Zapffel's silence is not phenomenon among phenomena or communicative strategy. It is collapse of phenomenological and communicative frameworks themselves. When consciousness recognizes its impossibility, philosophical analysis of silence becomes one more defensive operation. We analyze silence rather than inhabit it, convert recognition into topic rather than sustaining recognition. Maurice Blanchot's writing about disaster and impossible community suggests language that approaches its own impossibility. Blanchot's fragments gesture toward what cannot be stated, circling recognition that constantly withdraws. His prose performs aporia rather than resolving it, creating space where thought encounters its limits. This seems closest to what Zapffian philosophy might become after recognizing its own contradictions. Not systematic philosophy, but fragmentary gestures toward recognition that cannot be sustained. Yet even Blanchot's writing remains literature, aesthetic objects that readers consume and interpret. The gesture toward impossibility becomes new kind of possibility, negative expression that still expresses. Perhaps there is no escape from this paradox. Even silence, when noted or pointed to, becomes statement. Zapffe himself never achieved philosophical silence, continuing to write throughout his life. This persistence suggests that consciousness cannot simply stop philosophizing once it recognizes philosophy's inadequacy. The recognition itself generates need to articulate what has been recognized, even when articulation contradicts content. We are compelled to speak about what cannot be spoken about, to write what undermines writing. Perhaps this compulsion reveals something essential about consciousness. We cannot rest in recognition, but must convert recognition into expression. The drive to communicate, to convince others, to build arguments, operates independently of whether communication succeeds or arguments hold. Consciousness continues its operations even after recognizing that operations lack foundation. The silence after philosophy would not be simple absence of discourse. It would be inhabited silence, consciousness continuing to exist while recognizing that existence has no justification. This differs from pre-philosophical silence before questions arise. Post-philosophical silence knows what it silences, maintains awareness of what cannot be said. The distinction resembles difference between innocence and experience. Pre-philosophical consciousness has not yet confronted its own impossibility. Post-philosophical consciousness has confronted and recognized impossibility, but continues nevertheless. This continuation without justification might be what remains after philosophy exhausts itself. Yet even describing post-philosophical silence involves philosophical discourse. We cannot reach position beyond philosophy using philosophical means. Every attempt to articulate what comes after philosophy extends philosophy rather than transcending it. This suggests that silence after philosophy may be literally unthinkable and unstatable. Not because mystical truth transcends thought, but because consciousness attempting to think beyond itself encounters structural impossibility. We are trapped in philosophical discourse even when recognizing discourse's inadequacy. The only genuine silence would be cessation of consciousness itself. Until then, philosophy continues, acknowledging its impossibility while performing that impossibility through continuing to philosophize. Zapffel's legacy ultimately points toward this paradox as perhaps the most honest philosophical position available to consciousness. We cannot resolve our situation through thought, yet we cannot stop thinking about our situation. Philosophy becomes perpetual performance of consciousness, encountering its own limits without transcending them. The silence after philosophy is not destination to reach, but impossibility to recognize. Recognizing this impossibility does not free us, but accurately describes our predicament. We continue existing, defending, thinking, writing, knowing that all of it lacks foundation. Perhaps this ongoing acknowledgement of groundlessness, without hope of resolution or escape, represents the most consciousness can achieve. Not wisdom, not enlightenment, not authenticity, but simple recognition that we are biological accidents burdened with awareness we cannot bear and cannot eliminate. The silence is always already here, beneath and within all our speaking. Philosophy cannot reveal it because philosophy is part of the noise.